Chapter 4487. I'll go with you to the south courtyard and ask how or what's going on. Then we can make preparations as soon as possible. Pan Hong pushed the wheelchair to Pan Ning. Okay. Pan Ning pushed him out and said to his father, "Father, we'll go and ask." "Don't worry." Pan Ning's father watched them leave and shook his head with a sigh. He also got up and walked out. When Pan Ning and the others arrived at the south courtyard, they saw that it was very quiet. They didn't see the three children come out, so they asked 17 to go in and inform them. "First young master, second young master Hao told us not to disturb them these days." This 17 was a little embarrassed. "You go and call Hao, I'll take responsibility if anything happens." Pan Ning gestured. If this wasn't an important matter, they wouldn't disturb them. Seeing this, 17 responded and walked inside. She came to Hao's door and reported, "Young Master Hao, first young master and second young master are outside." They said it's urgent. Hao, who was cultivating in the room, slowly opened his eyes when he heard the sound. He exhaled softly and restrained his spiritual aura. Then he got up and opened the door to leave the room. When he came outside, he saw Pan Hong and Pan Ning. He said, "Uncle Hong, Uncle Ning, please come in." The two nodded and walked into the courtyard with him. They came to the stone table and sat down. Before he spoke, Pan Ning told him, "We came to find you because we have something to ask. That day when we went to the Emperor Temple, did you ask for some kind of sign?" Hearing this, Hao glanced at them and asked instead of answering, "What's wrong?" The Pan brothers looked at each other. Pan Hong said, "It said that the Buddha of the Emperor Temple showed that the person who asked for the sign was a divine fetus. Now the news has spread. The abbot of the Emperor Temple and Nothingness have been summoned to the palace by His Majesty. It won't be long before people from the palace come here. So we want to ask, what kind of sign was it? Was there really a vision?" Hao's handsome little face turned cold. He asked, "How did the news spread?" "It said that other monks heard Nothingness talking in his sleep, so it spread." Pan Ning said and looked at Hao. He asked, "What about the sign? What does it say?" "I've already thrown away the bamboo stick. As for what was written on the stick, it was..." Hao repeated the few lines of the stick. Hearing his words, the two's faces became somewhat grave. Pan Hong's eyes were filled with unconcealable astonishment and blankness. Especially after seeing his younger brother's unsurprised expression, the shock in his heart became even more unconcealable. He had guessed that Hao and the other two's identities were not simple, but he had never expected them to be so complicated. Divine fetus? Could it be that they were not mortals, but an immortal? Could it be that the three of you are not mortals, but immortals? Pan Hong asked, unable to conceal his shock. "He's not an immortal. He's just a cultivator." Hao looked at him and said, "However, our identities are indeed extraordinary. This is also the reason why we have to keep it a secret. There really are immortals in this world." Pan Hong murmured. His heart was in a state of shock. Chapter 4488. Hearing this, Pan Hong calmed himself down. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. After his mood gradually calmed down, he pondered for a while and said, "Since His Majesty has summoned the Emperor Temple's abbot in Jiao Wu, I'm afraid we can't hide the matter of the sign." He glanced at the two of them and slowly said, "His Majesty has been searching for immortality for some time now. He won't let go of this opportunity, especially since Hao and the other two are still in our home. I'm afraid that once this matter is known, in addition to the fact that I was judged by the highly skilled doctor and the city's physician that I wouldn't live past that night, he will undoubtedly believe that you are immortals. Then what should we do?" Pan Ning couldn't help but ask anxiously. In terms of scheming and thinking, he was far inferior to his brother. Now that his brother also knew about this matter, he would at least feel more at ease with him coming up with ideas and solutions. Pan Hong pondered for a while and said, "If His Majesty asks, we have to say we don't know. Otherwise, if he blames us for deceiving the Emperor, we will be in big trouble. As for how, and the other two, if His Majesty asks, you also have to say you don't know. After all, you are still young and can say you don't know about the sign. As for the immortal fetus, it's just what the sign said. There is no other evidence. Even if His Majesty guesses, he can't be sure. Also, you have to explain this matter to Mu Chen and you, her. If you go to the palace, we will accompany you and act according to the circumstances." Pan Hong looked at Hao and said, I understand." Hao responded and said, "I'll go tell them first." As he spoke, he walked to the room where Mu Chen and Mu Yu were. At the same time, the palace sent people. At this time, they entered the residence and were led by Pan Ning's father to the southern courtyard. In the southern courtyard, Pan Hong and Pan Ning saw the people from the palace and looked at each other. Before they could speak, they heard their father say, "These people are from the palace. They say they want to invite Hao, and the other two to the palace." Pan Ning's father's face was a little dignified. He didn't expect things to turn out like this. In particular, he was even more uneasy because he didn't know anything. In the room, after Hao explained a few things to Mu Chen and Mu Yu, the three of them went out of the room. After taking a look at the people from the palace, they followed Pan Ning out. Apart from Pan Ning, no one else in the Pan family was allowed to come along. Even Pan Hong was ordered to stay behind. The three children followed Pan Ning into the palace and came to a side chamber. The person who led the way asked them to wait for a while and went in to report. Not long after, there was a voice asking them to enter. However, when Pan Ning wanted to follow in, he was stopped. "Second young master, please wait for a moment. His Majesty said to let the three children in and will summon second young master later." Pan Ning's heart sank when he heard this. He couldn't help but glance at Hao, and the other two. "Hao, take good care of the two little ones." Pan Ning could only instruct. Hao responded and led Mu Chen and Mu Yu inside. When they entered the side hall, they saw that other than the Emperor, who was seated in the main seat, there was an old man standing beside him, as well as the host and nothingness. Perhaps he felt guilty, but when he saw the three children enter, the abbot put his palms together and murmured, "Amitabha." Chapter 4489. These are the three little immortals. His Majesty, who was sitting at the top, had a strange look in his eyes. He looked at the three children standing in the hall. The oldest one was only about 10 years old, but he was very good-looking. His facial features were clear and handsome. It could be seen that in the future, he would grow up to be an outstanding man. What surprised him even more was that this young boy's aura was so different from the others. He had a noble aura about him, and there was also an intimidating aura about him. This was not something an ordinary child could possess. Looking at him, he was even more certain of his guess. This little boy must be an immortal. Looking at the pair of children about 4 years old next to him, they looked exactly the same. Their outstanding facial features were exquisite and lovely, like immortal children. They were so good-looking that people couldn't take their eyes off them. These three children each had their own characteristics and were so extraordinary. Even his princes and sons could not compare to them. Saying that they were not immortals. How could he believe that? Hao, and the others stood and watched without speaking. Seeing this, His Majesty looked at Liao Wu and asked, which child was the one who shook the lot? "Your Majesty, it was that little girl," Liao Wu said nervously, not daring to look at Hao, and the others. The abbot sighed softly and said, "Your Majesty, the matter of the lot is not serious. They are just ordinary children. I will decide whether they are immortals or not." His Majesty chuckled. Clearly, he did not take his words seriously. Instead, he looked at the three children and finally at you, her. He showed a gentle smile and asked, "What is your name?" Yu glanced at her eldest brother and said, "I am Xianyuan Muyue." "How dare you? How dare you be so rude in front of His Majesty?" A shout came from the person who brought them in. His Majesty picked up his tea and took a sip, as if he did not hear the shout. Seeing this, the eunuch shouted again, "Hurry up and kneel when you see His Majesty." Hao Er's face turned cold, and his aura also froze. Even Mu Chen's face was tense. He pursed his lips and looked displeased. "Your Majesty." The host opened his mouth, but was stopped by the emperor, who was sitting in the upper seat. He looked at the three children below and smiled. "No matter how noble your background is, when you come here and see me, you have to kneel and greet me because I am the most supreme person here. However, if you admit yourselves that you are immortals, then there is no need to kneel. Not only that, but I will also treat you with respect. We won't kneel." As Hao spoke, his gaze fell on the emperor. "So you're saying that you're immortals?" His Majesty's eyes lit up and he said, "If that's the case, then quickly show me your immortal spells and broaden my horizons. Can immortals really live forever?" "We are not immortals," Hao said coldly. They were not immortals to begin with, but cultivators. Hearing this, the smile on the emperor's face suddenly sank. The teacup in his hand was slammed to the side with a loud bang. The tea spilled out of the teacup and splashed all over the table. "How dare you make fun of me?" Chapter 4490. "Umitba, Your Majesty, please quell your anger," the abbot said softly. He stepped forward and said, "They are only children." The commotion in the side chamber made Pan Ning, who was standing guard outside, anxious. He tried to enter several times but was stopped. He could only pace back and forth anxiously. In the side chamber. "Children? Humph. Have you ever seen a child remain neither arrogant, humble, nor panicked in the face of my wrath?" He snorted coldly and narrowed his eyes as he stared at the three children. He secretly admired them in his heart. These three children were so young, but their courage and insight were very big. It seemed that they really were immortals. His face was angry, but his mind was racing. His dignified gaze swept to the abbot and Liao Wu. He said, "You two, leave first." "Your Majesty." "Leave." He shouted again in a low voice. Helpless, the abbot could only sigh softly and walk out. Behind him, Liao Wu walked quietly with his head lowered. The eunuch who brought the three children in also quietly left. Only the emperor, an old man beside him, and Hao were left in the large side chamber. He eased his expression and looked at the three people standing below. He said, "Tell me. Who are you people? Since you are immortals, why are you here? How did you come here? Is there really a place for immortals in this world?" "I don't know," Hao said. He wasn't afraid of that person. With his current strength, he could naturally protect his younger siblings in this mortal world. If they really couldn't stay here any longer, then they would leave this place. In any case, they had to find a way back. "Aren't you afraid that I will kill you?" He narrowed his eyes and stared at them with a dangerous look. He said, "Even if you aren't afraid, aren't you afraid of implicating the Pan family?" Hao Er's face grew colder and colder when he heard this. Even Mu Chen and Mu Yu, although they didn't say anything, had a trace of anger in their eyes. The old man standing beside His Majesty had been secretly observing them. He realized that after His Majesty's words, the aura of the three of them suddenly changed. Among them, a flash of murderous intent in the eyes of the eldest child made him feel apprehensive. It was precisely because of this that when the emperor was about to threaten him, he hurriedly spoke up to stop him. "Your Majesty, why don't you let the Pan family's second young master in? Perhaps he will know where they came from. Inexplicably, the aura emanating from the older child sent a chill down his spine. He felt a bone-chilling coldness. His Majesty glanced at him and nodded. Thus, the old man took a deep breath and shouted towards the outside. Pan Ning, who had been waiting outside for a long time, was worried that something might have happened inside. When he heard the call for him, he quickly went in. Pan Ning greets your Majesty. He stepped forward and bowed, glancing at the children from the corner of his eyes. He saw that Hao Er's aura was slightly cold and his little face was stern. Mu Chen pursed his lips and didn't say anything. Yu lowered her head and played with the corner of her clothes. Seeing this, he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Pan Ning, I ask you, do you know the origins of these three children? The man narrowed his eyes and asked. He had been in a high position for a long time and held power in his hands. He wanted to have endless lifespan. Thus, even if the other party was an important minister under him, he still wanted to know the reason. Your Majesty, please forgive me. I don't know their origins. Pan Ning lowered his head and said. Chapter 4491. Pan Ning's heart sank, but he still lowered his head and respectfully said, I really don't know their origin. When I brought them back, it was only because I saw that they had suffered a disaster, and there was no lord by their side, so I brought them back home. I dare not deceive your Majesty in the slightest. Seeing this, his Majesty pursed his lips and glanced at him, then turned his gaze to the little girl in a pink dress and said, Previously, you said that your name is Xianyuan Mu Yu? N. Yu nodded. Then what are your parents' names? Yu Er's pair of beautiful eyes spun, and her eyes overflowed with a lively radiance. Beaming with smiles, she said, My father is called Xianyuan Mose, and my mother is called Fengjiu. Listening to the little girl's words, His Majesty's expression softened and asked, Then where are they now? I don't know. We forgot how to go home. Yu said in a soft voice. Then you. He was about to ask again when he saw the eunuch who had previously retreated hurriedly come in with an excited face. Your Majesty, great news, great news. His Majesty, who was about to get angry, heard this and leaned back on the dragon throne, asking neither hurriedly nor slowly, where did the joy come from? Reporting to your Majesty, the immortal has entered the palace and is now coming to the side hall. Does your Majesty want to see him now? Or? You said the immortal. His Majesty, who was originally leaning on the dragon throne, suddenly stood up with a happy face, and asked with an unconcealable excitement on his face, Where is the immortal now? Quickly, please come in. He thought for a moment, suppressed the joy in his heart, and sat down again. Looking at the several people in the hall, he waved his hand and said, Okay, you all withdraw first, go outside and wait, I have something to ask you in a while. In his opinion, even if these three children asked for a spirit lot, it was not as exciting as the visit of an immortal. Pan Ning quickly responded and led Hao and the other two out of the side hall. At this time, a man in a loose robe with a goatee came over. When he saw Mu Chen, Mu Yu and Hao his eyes lit up and his footsteps couldn't help but stop. He stared at them, and even his breathing was a little heavy. The other party's gaze was inexplicably scorching. It was difficult for Hao and the other two not to notice. The three of them looked at the man. The two little ones didn't notice anything. They just frowned. Their delicate little faces were filled with displeasure. However, after Hao saw that person, his face turned cold and a trace of killing intent flashed through his eyes. Because he perceived the other's aura. Was not a cultivator, but a demon. Hao what's wrong? Pan Ning couldn't help but ask in a low voice when he saw him stop and stare coldly at the immortal. Hao watched as the eunuch brought the man in and disappeared from sight. Only then did he say, This is not the place to talk. Pan Ning nodded. There were many eyes and ears in the palace, and this was definitely not a place to talk. But His Majesty told them to wait outside, and they couldn't go far. Amitba, benefactors. The host's voice sounded, and they looked over to see him and Liao Wu standing not far away looking at them. Seeing this, Pan Ning led them over. Before he could speak, the host looked at Hao, and the other two apologetically and said, "3 benefactors, we have caused trouble for you." He felt very apologetic, but unfortunately, now that things had developed like this, there was no way to cover it up. Chapter 4492. Being looked at so coldly by a small child, Master Wu also lowered his head in shame. After all, they were in the wrong in this matter. Moreover, they were monks, yet they had caused the 3 children to fall into such a situation. They really shouldn't have done that. What's done is done. There's no point in talking about it. Pan Ning said and patted Mu Chen's shoulder. While the few of them were chatting, in the side hall, the emperor was looking at the man in the loose robe with suspicion. This man is an immortal. He doesn't look any different from us. Could it be that he's a fake? Therefore, he wanted to test him. May I ask, immortal, where is your home? What kind of immortal technique do you practice? May I have the honor of witnessing an immortal's immortal technique? He asked, his gaze falling on the bearded man. This little immortal has been traveling around. I heard that your majesty has the heart to seek immortality, so I came to take a look. He stroked his beard and smiled. Looking at the emperor, he said, if your majesty wants to see this little immortal's immortal technique, there's nothing wrong with that. After all, your majesty is the true dragon, the son of heaven. What's the harm in having a look? As he spoke, he smiled and placed one hand behind his back and the other behind his back. As the aura on his body surged, he slowly flew up into the air. Below his feet, a cloud of white clouds condensed, making him look like an immortal and otherworldly being. Hiss. An immortal. He's really an immortal. Even the emperor couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air when he saw this scene. He was so excited that he stood up. This was the first time he saw an immortal in the legends. Immortals could really ride the clouds. How extraordinary. Even the old man standing next to the emperor narrowed his eyes when he saw this scene. Obviously, this was the first time he saw an immortal in the legends. Immortal, may I ask how to live forever? He couldn't wait to ask. Hearing this, the immortal's heart skipped a beat. His eyes flashed and he stroked his beard. With a wave of his sleeve, an alchemy cauldron appeared at the side of the hall. Looking at the huge cauldron that appeared out of thin air, the emperor was even more convinced that this was an immortal. Besides immortals, who else could make such a huge thing appear out of thin air? Immortal, this is? He asked in confusion. He slowly descended, and the white clouds under his feet disappeared. He stood with his hands behind his back, and said unhurriedly, this is this immortal's alchemy furnace. If your majesty wants to live forever, this immortal only needs to refine a pill for you to live forever. However. But what? The emperor quickly asked. The immortal looked at the emperor and said with a smile, it's just that the medicine in the mortal world is not spiritual medicine and cannot be used at all. Even if this immortal wants to help your majesty achieve longevity, I am powerless. Hearing this, he was stunned and hurriedly asked, then what should we do? Is there any other way? Immortal, please help me achieve my wish of immortality. I can promise you the position of Grand Preceptor. I can promise you endless wealth and supreme status. He stroked his beard, glanced at him, and said, if your majesty really wants to live forever, this immortal has a way. Moreover, I just saw an excellent medicinal primer. What medicinal primer? Immortal, please tell me. No matter what it is, I will definitely get it. He said hurriedly. Chapter 4493. Hearing this, not to mention the emperor, even the silent old man's pupils constricted. Clearly, he did not dare to believe it. Refining a child into a pill? How could that be? The emperor was stunned. He looked at him and did not speak for a long time. Refining a 3 to 4-year-old child into a pill? This kind of thing was too bloody and cruel. He had never even thought of such a thing. Although he wanted to live forever, he was not a fatuous ruler. Even if he was the emperor, he would not dare to do such a thing that would anger the heavens and the people. Immortal, you said that refining the 2 children into a pill would allow me to live forever? He frowned and looked at the immortal in front of him. They are just 2 children who look better. How could they have such a miraculous effect? Moreover, refining people into pills, this is. He did not dare to speak of evil arts. After all, he was afraid of angering the immortal in front of him. Your Majesty, even if you are the emperor, you can't see that the 2 children have innate spiritual energy. They are spiritual embryos with great nourishment. Such spiritual embryos are hard to come by. There was a hint of excitement in his eyes. Thinking of the 2 children, he could not help but swallow his saliva. The emperor looked at his expression and his heart moved. He gradually calmed down. His originally excited heart cooled down as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over it. He smiled and said, Immortal, how about this? You must be tired from the journey. Go and rest first. I will think about this later. All right. However, Your Majesty, you must take good care of those 2 children. He put away the pill furnace and said worriedly. He did not think of anything else. He felt that if a mortal wanted to live forever, why would they think of anything else? However, he did not think that as the emperor of a country, he was not a fatuous ruler. He would always think about things over and over again. Why would he really do as he said and capture the 2 children to refine them into pills? After asking someone to take him away, the emperor sat on the dragon throne and slowly exhaled. After a moment of silence, he asked, What do you think? The old man thought for a moment and said, This is strange. Immortals should be righteous people. Why would they use children to refine pills? Such a bloody and cruel thing, even those whose hands are stained with blood would not think of it. Moreover, why would it be those 2 children? The old man paused and hesitantly said, Also, I have been observing the celestial. When the celestial talked about the child, his eyes lit up and he even swallowed his saliva. I'm afraid that if the child is refined into a pill, it will be the celestial that wants to eat it, right? The emperor nodded and said, I also feel that this immortal's behavior and words are a little different from the immortals in the legends, but he does no immortal magic. Those 3 children are not ordinary people either. They were too calm when they saw Your Majesty. They were not frightened, nor did they panic. They are not ordinary people. Your Majesty, why don't you get more information from them? The old man suggested. Hearing this, the emperor pondered for a while and had an idea in his heart. He called for someone to bring Pan Ning and the others over. Pan Ning, who was talking to the host, heard the summons. He bowed to the 2 of them and walked back with the 3 children. The host and Nothingness thought for a moment and followed. Why are you here too? The emperor glanced at the host and Nothingness who followed behind and raised his eyebrows. Chapter 44-94. The emperor glanced at them and said, Since you're here, stand at the side and listen. As he spoke, he looked at the 3 children standing in the middle. His gaze swept past Hao, and landed on the 2 little ones. What was so special about these 2 children? They actually said that they could live forever if they were refined into elixirs. He felt strange. If he really refined these 2 children into elixirs, would he still be able to swallow the elixirs? When everyone saw that he was only staring at the 2 little children, they could not help but guess what he was thinking. What was he thinking? After a long time, the emperor regained his senses and coughed lightly. He looked at the 3 of them and asked, did you see that immortal just now? Hao did not speak and only looked at him. Yu blinked and asked curiously, that one with the goatee is an immortal? Goatee? The emperor's mouth twitched. He clenched his fist and pressed it against his mouth. Then, he said, yes, that's him. He looked at the three of them and a faint light flashed through his eyes. He said tentatively, he told me that I could live forever if I refined you two little ones into elixirs. After he finished speaking, he instantly felt the atmosphere in the side hall turn cold. An icy aura immediately filled the air. Moreover, there was a faint oppressive pressure that caused one to be unable to breathe. This caused him to be shocked. His eyes narrowed as he suddenly looked at Xianyuan Hao, who had a cold expression on his face. The aura on this child's body was even more terrifying than the emperor's. Why was this? While he was shocked, he faintly felt the aura in his body surging toward his throat. A trace of blood spread in his mouth. He groaned and suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. Pfft! Your Majesty! Your Majesty! Your Majesty! The old man, Pan Ning, the abbot, and nothingness in the hall were all shocked and suddenly cried out in alarm. After the exclamation, the old man guarding the emperor immediately attacked Hao. However, he didn't expect that before he could even get close to Hao, he was sent flying by Hao's flick of his hand. With a bang, he crashed heavily into a corner of the hall. He spat out blood and was unable to stand up for a long time. Pan Ning's face changed. He hurriedly called out and said anxiously, Hao, calm down. Big brother. Yu pulled his sleeve and softly called out. Children were the most sensitive. She could clearly feel that the emperor had no intention of killing them. Humph. Hao snorted coldly and withdrew the pressure he had released. In a flash, it was as if it had never appeared. However, only the people in the palace knew that just now, everyone was fine except for the emperor who had spat out a mouthful of blood. The emperor was also extremely shocked. He only felt that the aura above his head, which made it hard for him to breathe, had disappeared in an instant. His entire body relaxed, as if he had come back to life. That feeling was too wonderful. So much so that when he recovered his senses, his eyes were abnormally bright as he looked at Hao. At this moment, he was certain that these three children were not ordinary children. They were immortals. Cough cough. He coughed softly and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. Don't worry, I have no evil intentions. I only wanted to test you because I suspect that immortal is not an immortal. Chapter 4495. Listening to his words, Pan Ning's forehead began to sweat, and he could feel the sweat on his back drenching his clothes. He was afraid that Yang Kai would be angry and vent his anger on the Pan family. For a moment, his body stiffened, and he didn't dare to speak. He just lowered his head and stood there calmly. If his big brother was here, he would know what to do. Hao looked at the bright-eyed emperor and pursed his lips. Seeing that there was no one else in the hall other than these people who knew about them, he said, we are not immortals, but we are immortal cultivators. Hearing this, the emperor was overjoyed and immediately smiled. He wanted to ask something but paused. He frowned and asked, what about the immortal from before? Is he the same as you? Who said it was an immortal cultivator? Hao glanced at him and said, it was just a demon that cultivated into a spirit. What? Demon? The emperor was shocked and his expression changed. There is such a thing in this world. Seeing that things were out in the open, Hao said, there are immortals and naturally there are demons. What's so strange about that? It's just that the spiritual energy in your mortal world is very weak. There should be fewer things that cultivate into demons. I guess that demon came from somewhere else. Our mortal world. Could it be that there are other worlds in this world besides this one? The emperor asked in a daze. He felt that the mysteries he had never encountered before were slowly unfolding in front of him. Of course. Hao looked at them and said, "There are 3,000 worlds in this world. The mortal world you are in is the lowest level. In this mortal world, there will be no immortal cultivators. Unless there is some great opportunity, you will not even see one immortal cultivator in your life. But I saw you. Ha 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 ha. Does this mean that I am also a person with great opportunity?" His eyes flashed and there was a faint excitement on his face. Hao glanced at him and pursed his lips. This emperor's skin was extraordinarily thick. Back then, when Pan Hong was judged to be unable to live past that night, it was you who saved him, right? The emperor did not mind his silence. At this time, he was still in a state of excitement. He stared at the three of them and asked, "What immortal abilities do you have? Can you show it to me? You haven't experienced it before." Hao looked at him strangely and thought to himself, "Does this person have a tendency to be abused? Ha ha ha, I want to know if you can ride the clouds. Can you move mountains and seas? Can you?" Before he could finish, he was interrupted by Hao. No. Hao snorted with a cold face. "Then what can you do?" he quickly asked again. The abbot, who had been silently digesting their words, quickly stepped forward when he saw this. He clasped his hands together and chanted, "Amitabha. Your Majesty, I feel that we should talk about the demon. Now that there is an evil demon beside your Majesty in the palace, it is a threat." Chapter 4496. Even if the three people in front of him were children, they were immortals who practiced immortal arts. Just because they couldn't do it didn't mean that they couldn't. Thinking of this, there was a faint trace of expectation in his heart. If he could see them deal with the demon, he would also see their ability. Hao frowned and was about to speak when he heard a gloomy voice. "Ha ha 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 ha. Are you discussing how to deal with me?" A gust of wind blew past and a figure rushed in. It almost didn't stop and rushed towards Mu Chen and Mu Yu. However, when it pounced on them, it was fiercely bounced back by a force. Puff! The figure was fiercely bounced to the side and spat out a mouthful of blood. It transformed into a human form and landed on the ground. It stepped back and stared at the two children with a gloomy gaze. "They actually have an evil warding magic treasure to protect them," Pan Ming exclaimed in a low voice. He only felt that his whole body was pushed to the side just now. Only then did he see that it was Hao who pushed him away. Otherwise, he would have been hit by the demon. While he was shocked, he couldn't help but look at the human-like demon. Could it be that Hao didn't say that they couldn't tell that this person was actually a demon? Hao looked at Mu Chen and Mu Yu and asked, "Are you okay?" It was because he knew that the two little ones had protective treasures given by their parents that they were not afraid of demons getting close to them. So, at that moment, he didn't pull them away and let the demon have a taste of the backlash of demon power. "We're fine." The two little ones shook their heads and didn't look frightened. "Go to the side." Hao gestured and then looked at the monster. With a move of his hand, a sword with a cold light appeared in his hand with a swoosh. The hidden spiritual power aura on his body spread out along with his strength. The spiritual power aura that could be seen with the naked eye wrapped around him, making him look even more extraordinary. The emperor and the old man narrowed their eyes, and there was a faint look of shock in their eyes. Pan Ming had seen Hao kill people, but he had never seen him kill demons. At this time, when he saw the sword that appeared out of thin air, his heart couldn't help but jump. When he saw the sword in Hao's hand and the aura of spiritual power emanating from the sword, the human-like evil demon was shocked. He immediately took a step back and stared at Hao in shock. Golden Core Cultivator. How is this possible? How could a 10-year-old child reach the level of a Golden Core Cultivator? This was impossible. You dare to have designs on my sister-in-law? I will definitely destroy your soul and make you unable to reincarnate. Hao snorted coldly and pointed the sword in his hand to the ground. His figure suddenly rushed forward and his sword moved at will, slashing towards the monster at a speed that was too fast for the ears to cover. Hiss! No! He cried out in alarm. Ignoring his human form, he immediately transformed into his original form and tried to escape. The other people in the hall only saw that the monster that looked like a human a moment ago had turned into a huge golden toad the next moment. It leaped on the ground and dodged Hao's attack with extreme speed. Whoosh! Bang! Chapter 4497. Your Majesty! Your Majesty! The abbot and Pan Ning's expressions changed as they cried out in alarm. The emperor did not expect the monster to charge at him. He instinctively retreated to avoid it, but his body seemed to be controlled by a force and could not move. At the same time, the old man beside the emperor rushed forward and slashed at the golden toad with the sword in his hand. However, there was only a clanging sound. When the sword in his hand was deflected, he was also sent flying. Bang! The old man was sent flying violently and crashed into a corner. When he looked up, he saw the golden toad hugging the emperor's body. The next moment, it let out a sinister laugh and instantly turned into a ray of light and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Your Majesty! The old man was shocked and stood up by supporting himself against the wall. The imperial guards outside rushed in and the commander shouted in a deep voice, "Who dares to assassinate in front of the palace? Arrest them! Stop!" Pan Ning shouted anxiously and quickly shielded Hao behind him. He faced the imperial guard commander and said, "It's a misunderstanding. It's just a misunderstanding. No one is trying to assassinate you. You may leave." The old man wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and ordered the imperial guard commander. Seeing the old man speak, the imperial guard commander hesitated for a moment. Just as he was about to leave, he heard the emperor's voice. That laughter was a little strange, causing the hearts of everyone in the hall to inexplicably tighten. This was especially so for the few people who had seen the demonic creature pounce towards the emperor and disappear into his body. Their expressions were exceptionally grave. It's not a misunderstanding. These people are definitely trying to assassinate me. You, arrest them. The emperor, who had originally closed his eyes, opened his eyes and said sinisterly. His expression was somewhat strange and excited, causing Pan Ning, the abbot, and the old man's hearts to sink. Was the emperor being controlled by an evil monster? However, before they could recover from their inconceivable shock, they heard the imperial guard commander respectfully reply, "Yes. Arrest them all." With that order, the imperial guards rushed out and quickly restrained the abbot and Pan Ning. When they got close to Pan Ning, the imperial guards were repelled by Pan Ning and he shouted in a deep voice, "It's not what you see. They won't listen to you. They will only listen to the emperor. However, the emperor has been possessed and controlled by that demon." Hao said calmly. His cold little face was indifferent, but he held his sword and stood in front of his younger brother and sister. His mind was quickly thinking of a solution. "All of you, back off!" shouted the old man in a deep voice. The old man was the emperor's trusted aide and his words usually carried a lot of weight. However, at this moment, the imperial guard commander hesitated. "Leave the two young ones alive. As for the rest, kill them on the spot." The emperor's gloomy voice sounded at this moment, undoubtedly causing the already tense atmosphere in the hall to become even more tense. Yes. The imperial guard no longer hesitated. He drew his sword and attacked Pan Ning and the others in the hall. Even if they had doubts, a saint fate was a saint fate. They only needed to carry it out, there was no need to question it. Seeing the sword coming towards him, Pan Ning sucked in a breath of cold air. He had no weapon in his hand, so he could only retreat. However, he bumped into Hao, who was behind him. Chapter 4498. Come and kill him. The worst result is to drag this unlucky emperor down with you. He stared at Hao, gloomily and said, I don't know where you came from, but you broke my leg and ruined my plans. I will take revenge for this. Pan Ning and the old man stepped forward to block the door, and Lord Wu also went to help. The abbot looked at Hao, and asked worriedly, is there any way to force that monster out of His Majesty's body? That's His Majesty, we can't let anything happen to him. Yu's cunning eyes turned slightly. She took out something from her body and handed it to her brother, saying, Brother, use this. Don't take it off. Hao shouted. At the same time Yu took off the protective magic treasure on her body, the atmosphere in this side palace hall became a bit colder. Faintly, there was a bit of ghostly voice that entered their ears. Hiss. This. The abbot was also stunned. Even though he was the abbot of the Emperor Temple, he had never experienced such a situation. Where did those Yin souls come from? One by one, they floated in the corner of the side palace, emitting faint sounds from their mouths. Yu also didn't expect that so many ghosts would appear when she took off the treasure on her body. She immediately put it back on. Hao took a deep breath and said seriously to Mu Chen and Mu Yu, didn't I tell you to remember my words? Don't take off the things on your body. Once those ghosts get close to you, I won't know how to save you if father and mother are not here. Brother, I'm sorry. Yu lowered her head. She didn't want to cause trouble. She just wanted to help her brother force out that golden toad demon. After all, if she had the treasure on her body, that golden toad demon wouldn't dare to attach itself to the emperor. You have to remember that no one's life is more precious than yours. No matter what, you have to put your own safety first. Hao said. After glancing at the two, he stared at the emperor. The next moment, he condensed a breath in his hands and attacked fiercely. The golden toad didn't even think before it tried to block the attack. However, its strength was no match for a golden core cultivator, not to mention such a small freak. In its panic, it was tied up by a rope, and its entire body was tied to the dragon throne, unable to move. What do you want? He stared at Hao, approaching step by step and couldn't help but panic. He immediately shouted, Guards! Help! Help! Marquis Qi was worried that something would happen to the three children because of Pan Hong's visit, so he invited him into the palace to say a few words. One reason was that he was also curious about the three children and he liked them. Therefore, when Pan Hong came, he agreed and went to the palace to see what was going on. Unexpectedly, when he arrived at the side chamber, he saw a group of imperial guards outside banging on the door. Inside the side chamber that was closed, the emperor's cry for help could be heard. His face immediately changed. He strode forward and asked in a deep voice, What happened? Who dares to kidnap His Majesty? My lord. When the imperial guards saw him, he hurriedly stepped forward. The Pan family's second young master and the head steward are all inside. I don't know why they're holding the emperor hostage, but the doors are locked. We're afraid that if we rush in, they'll harm the emperor. We don't know what to do, so we ask the Marquis to decide. Chapter 4499. Hearing this, the imperial guard waved his hand to signal for everyone to retreat. He stepped forward and shouted, Pan Ning, what's going on with you? Why aren't you opening the door? My lord, we have no intention of harming His Majesty. It's just that this matter can't be explained in a few words. In order to prevent the Imperial Guard from accidentally injuring people, we can't open the door. Pan Ning replied from inside. Looking at the Emperor who was tied to the dragon throne, he couldn't help but ask anxiously, how is it? Doing such a thing, even if His Majesty was possessed by an evil spirit, was still a great disrespect. He was risking the lives of the entire Pan family here. Moreover, there were ghosts floating in the air that could be seen with the naked eye. It was really frightening. Bastard! Why can't I open it? Open the door and let this Marquis in. Otherwise, you won't be able to bear the consequences of frightening His Majesty. Marquis Chi shouted from outside. Seeing that no one responded for a long time, his face darkened and he took a step back. How many people are inside? Do you know? He asked in a deep voice. Not many people. Other than the abbot and master of the Emperor Temple, there are 3 children, an elder Tian and Du by His Majesty's side. The Imperial Guard quickly replied. Hearing this, he pondered for a moment and instructed the Imperial Guard, without this Marquis' permission, don't act rashly. I'll go in and see what's going on. He didn't believe that Pan Ning was holding His Majesty hostage. The father and son of the Pan family were deeply trusted by His Majesty and could be said to be his confidants. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in such high positions. Moreover, there weren't many people in the hall. It was impossible to do such a thing in front of the abbot and the 3 children of the Emperor Temple. The door is closed. How is my lord going to enter? The Imperial Guard asked. Marquis Chi glanced at him and his gaze fell on the roof of the hall that was more than 10 meters high. He immediately took a leap and quietly landed on the roof of the hall. He walked towards a small skylight above. He didn't disturb them. Instead, he bent over to see what was going on in the palace. When he saw what was going on, he couldn't help but be shocked. His expression changed drastically. The emperor, who was tied to the dragon throne, was struggling. His face was red and ferocious. Standing in front of him was the child named Xianyuan Hao. At this time, his hands were forming some strange seals and he was mumbling something. A breath visible to the naked eye followed his fingertips and pointed directly at the emperor's forehead. In the next moment, the shape of a golden toad faintly appeared on the emperor's body and he let out a miserable cry. Hiss! What was going on? His eyes widened in shock. The scene in the palace had long exceeded the scope of his understanding. Ah! A shrill scream came out of the emperor's mouth. The image of a golden toad appeared on his body. Perhaps unable to bear the pain, the golden toad attached to the emperor screamed. In the next moment, a light flashed and escaped toward the palace door in front of him. Trying to escape. Hao snorted coldly. He threw out a silver net in his hand and caught the golden toad tightly. The more the golden toad struggled, the tighter the silver net became. It was so tight that bloody marks appeared on the toad's body. His Majesty! The old man quickly went forward to help the fainted emperor. He quickly untied the rope on his body and pinched his Renjong point, but he couldn't wake him up. Chapter 4500. However, his composure was relatively good, and he quickly calmed down. Looking at the chaotic side hall, his gaze fell on Hao, but he asked Pan Ning, what's going on? What is this thing? And those, how did it appear? Some of the Yin souls floating in the corner were dressed in white, with long hair draped over their shoulders. Their faces were pale and lifeless, while others had their heads drooped, making it impossible to see their faces clearly. They let out faint voices. Even someone like him, who didn't believe in ghosts and evil, couldn't help but feel his heart skip a beat when he saw this scene. There were really ghosts in this world. Why are you still here? Do you want me to destroy your souls? Hao shouted coldly. The spiritual aura on his body attacked with pressure. Those ghosts who were still floating and unwilling to leave immediately screamed and disappeared in the side hall in the next moment. As those ghosts dispersed, the cold atmosphere in the hall also eased a little. Pan Ning and the others saw this and could not help but secretly breathe a sigh of relief. After a while, Pan Ning explained simply, "My lord, the so-called immortal that His Majesty invited into the palace is a demon. He attached himself to His Majesty, and that's why the previous incident happened. I didn't expect that there are demons in this world, and it's a golden toad demon. Marquis Qi vaguely guessed something. Looking at the huge golden toad tied up in the silver net on the ground, his eyes could not help but move slightly. That silver net seemed to be a treasure. Xian Yuan Hao, who was about 10 years old, was indeed not simple to be able to subdue this demon. Little immortal, His Majesty has been possessed by that demon. Will something happen to him? The old man could not help but ask worriedly when he could not wake the emperor up. He just had a few breaths of essence sucked out. He won't die. Hao said. He was about to go forward and ask where the golden toad came from when he was stopped by Pan Ning. Hao, can you wake His Majesty up first? If he doesn't wake up, I'm afraid this matter can't be resolved later. Hearing this, Hao stopped and looked at Mu Chen, saying, Chen, go and wake him up. All right. Mu Chen responded, his little face calm. He walked up to the dragon throne, condensed a bit of spiritual energy in his hand, and pressed it between the emperor's eyebrows. After a while, the emperor woke up. Your Majesty. Seeing this, the old man was relieved and bowed to Mu Chen gratefully. Thank you, little immortal. What happened just now? The emperor was stunned. He did not remember what had happened just now. He only felt that he was very weak and did not have the strength to speak. Only then did the old man tell him what had happened in a low voice. Young almsgiver, how should we deal with this demon? The abbot looked at Hao and asked. He was worried that if the demon escaped, it would cause trouble everywhere. Hao didn't say anything. He just walked up to the golden toad and asked coldly, where did you come from to the mortal realm? However, the golden toad didn't make a sound. It just stared at him with hatred. Seeing this, Hao turned his palm and a sharp sword pierced into the leg that wasn't cut off. Speak. The sharp sword pierced through and green blood seeped out. A miserable shriek came from the mouth of the golden toad. Ah! Are you going to speak or not? Hao pulled out his sword and prepared to stab down again. Even the Marquis of Qi couldn't help but be startled when he saw that indifferent expression and cold gaze. Chapter 45:01. When the golden toad saw that the sword was about to stab down again, it hurriedly opened its mouth and asked tentatively, if I tell you, can you spare my life? I promise that I will leave this place and never appear in this mortal world again. If it had known that there was such a little freak in this unremarkable mortal world, how would it have dared to be so rampant here? Right now, it was scared witless by this little youth in front of it. It was terrified from the bottom of its heart. Hao's eyes flashed as he stared at the golden toad and said, that depends on whether I am satisfied with what you say. After he finished speaking, he saw that everyone in the hall was staring at them from the corner of his eye. His heart moved and he called out. Chen, you, come here. When the two little fellows heard this, they trotted to his side. They saw that their big brother had set up a barrier with a wave of his hand, isolating the line of sight and sound so that the people outside the barrier could not see or hear what they were saying. Big brother, can't we let them hear? You asked doubtfully. They are only mortals in the end. It is not good for them to know too much about cultivation. Hao looked at the golden toad and said, you can speak now. Hearing this, the golden toad was delighted, thinking that it had won a chance of survival. It immediately said, I am a golden toad formed after cultivating for 500 years. I snuck out from the floating Fate Immortal Island. Floating Fate Immortal Island. Where is it? How far is it from here? Hao hurriedly asked. That is a place isolated from the mortal world. It is a place for cultivators. I am not a flying demon, so it took me more than 2 months to come here from there. The golden toad quickly said, however, if you have an aircraft or a flying sword, it will only take about a month to reach the floating Fate Immortal Island from here. Moreover, I drew a map after coming out of the floating Fate Immortal Island. If you follow the map, you will be able to reach the floating Fate Immortal Island. It looked at Hao and begged for mercy. I have already told you everything I know. Please spare my life. Where is the map? Hao asked. The golden toad paused for a moment before opening its mouth and spitting out a Qianquan bag. The map is inside. Hao opened it and confirmed that there was a map inside. He glanced at it and kept it. He then asked, what kind of place is the floating Fate Immortal Island? The more you say, the more likely I am to spare your life and let you go. Hearing this, the golden toad was overjoyed. It didn't dare to hide anything and carefully told them everything it knew about the floating Fate Celestial Island. Outside the barrier, the Emperor, Pan Ning, and the others were startled when they saw the three children's monster disappear into thin air. They wondered what had happened. Have they left? The Emperor asked with a frown. Looking at the figures that disappeared into thin air, he felt a little anxious. He hadn't asked the three children how to achieve immortality, so how could they leave? Probably not. As Qi Bohu spoke, he reached out his hand. He was a martial artist and was more sensitive to airflow fluctuations. At this time, even if he couldn't see, he could feel that there was something not far in front of him. Therefore, he stretched out his hand, but after touching the airflow, he was bounced back and his whole body retreated a few meters. Chapter 4502. Seeing that he couldn't see or hear anything, Marquis Qi paused and said, Your Majesty, the Imperial Guards outside are still standing guard. I'll go out and deal with them. Let them leave first. All right, go. The Emperor leaned against the dragon throne and looked at the empty hall, waiting for the three children to appear. At the same time, he wondered why they used this immortal technique to conceal themselves. Could it be that there was something they didn't want them to know? As time passed, the Emperor grew impatient. He stood up and walked around a few times before sitting down again. Suddenly, an extremely unpleasant smell filled the air, causing him to cover his nose and mouth. What's that smell? He asked in a deep voice. Then, he saw the three children who had originally disappeared reappear in his line of sight. And in front of them, the golden toad demon that was bound by the silver net had already turned into a pool of green blood. That foul stench was emitted from that pool of blood. You killed it? The Emperor's face was filled with surprise as he looked at the cold-faced Xianyuan Hao. From what he heard earlier, it seemed that if the demon told them something useful, they wouldn't kill it. Hao led his younger brother and sister away to prevent their boots from being stained with the foul smell. When he heard the Emperor's words, he looked at him coldly and said, It was destined to die from the moment it set its sights on my younger brother and sister. In other words, he had never thought of sparing its life. When the Emperor heard this, he looked at the young boy and his heart couldn't help but tremble. The young boy was warning him. Amitba. It's good that the demon is dead. If it weren't for the young benefactor, I'm afraid no one here would be able to deal with it. The abbot stepped forward and said. Seeing that the demon was dead and the matter was resolved, the identities of the three children could no longer be hidden. The Emperor naturally wouldn't do anything to them, so he took his leave. Seeing this, the Emperor let Marquis Qi leave first. After the two monks and Marquis Qi left, only the Emperor, the old man, Pan Ning, and the three children were left in the side hall. Seeing that the atmosphere in the hall was a little strange, Hao looked at the Emperor and asked, Can we leave now? You still want to return to the Pan family? The Emperor glanced at the three of them before he glanced at Pan Ning and said, Why don't all of you stay in the palace? No need. Hao's rejection was very thorough. He didn't give him any face at all. Seeing this, the Emperor narrowed his eyes and stared at him, saying, It's fine if you don't want to stay, but did that monster tell you where it came from? Also, there are immortals and demons in this world. Then, Do you immortal cultivators also have the art of immortality? How's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the emperor and said, like us, it came from the other side of the heaven realm. It's just that it came from a different place. Even immortal cultivators don't have immortality. The lifespan of immortal cultivators is just longer than you mortals. Can't immortal pills and elixirs increase one's lifespan? Come back from the dead. The emperor stared at Hao and said, since you were able to save Pan Hong back then, you naturally have an elixir of immortality with you, right? You can tell me what you want. I just want a few immortal pills. Chapter 4503. 2 pills. The emperor glanced at him, implying that 2 pills were too little. That's right, 2 pills. One is an antidote pill that can cure hundreds of poisons, and the other is a pill that can save one's life in a dangerous situation. Hao looked at him and said, for you mortals, no matter which pill you take, other than resolving immediate danger, it is also very beneficial to your body. Even if it can't increase your lifespan by 100 or 80 years, it will still increase your lifespan by a dozen years. Hearing this, the emperor's eyes flashed and his heart skipped a beat. He said, all right. Tell me, what's the condition you're talking about? Hao glanced at Pan Ning and then said to the emperor, the Pan family has done us a favor. The condition for giving you the 2 pills is to protect the Pan family and ensure that they have no worries for 3 generations. Hearing this condition, the emperor was a little surprised and involuntarily looked at Pan Ning. After hearing this, Pan Ning's heart trembled. He did not expect Hao to ask for 3 generations of peace for them. This was a very deep friendship. No problem. The emperor looked at Hao and said, the Pan family has always been highly valued by me. I can guarantee that they will have no worries for 3 generations. Even if I am no longer around after 100 years, I will still give the order. However, when Hao heard this, he shook his head. That's not right. It should be an imperial edict or something. After all, you are you and your son is your son. He may not necessarily do as you say. You. The emperor glared at him. He felt that this boy did not know what was good for him. However, he did not think much of such a condition. Therefore, he said, all right, I will give a secret edict. Let Pan Ning bring it back home. In the future, as long as the Pan family does not rebel, no matter which prince is on the throne in the future, I will guarantee that they will have no worries for 3 generations. He waved his hand and gestured for the old man to prepare. Not long after, he wrote a secret edict and stamped it. Finally, he let the old man hand it to Pan Ning. At the same time, he said to Hao, this should be enough, right? Pan Ning held the secret edict in both hands and stood there in a daze. He was so shocked that he couldn't react until Hao walked up to him and took the edict from his hands. He looked at it and put it back in his hands. Only then did he come back to his senses and hurriedly kneel down. On behalf of the 3 generations of the Pan family, this subject thanks your majesty for your boundless kindness. His hands were trembling as he held the secret edict. He had never thought that he would obtain such a precious treasure on this trip to the palace. When the emperor saw Hao checking the imperial edict, he gritted his teeth and thought to himself, what kind of parents would raise such a son? How infuriating. He was the ruler of a country. Could it be that he would lie to him? He actually went to check the authenticity of the imperial edict. How annoying. All right. Get up and stand aside. The emperor waved his hand and looked at the boy. Hao then took out 2 small bottles from his space and handed them forward. He said, these 2 pills are very precious. Even in the cultivation world, they are priceless treasures. After taking the pills, the emperor looked at the name written on the bottle and saw 2 words at the bottom of the bottle. He muttered softly, Ghost Doctor. He looked at Hao and asked, who is this ghost doctor? Chapter 4504. From the moment he said those words, the emperor knew that they wanted to leave. Hearing him say this, he wasn't surprised and just nodded. I understand. He looked at Pan Ning and said, you take them back. Yes, Pan Ning replied. After bowing, he left with Hao, and the other two. After watching them leave and disappear from sight, the emperor looked at the two bottles in his hand and sighed. I didn't expect that on this day, I would not only meet demons, but also immortals. I even obtained 2 precious pills. The old man stood quietly at the side. He didn't say anything because he knew that the emperor didn't need him to say anything. Pan Ning kept the secret edict in his arms. He felt that his steps were light as a feather. It wasn't until he left the palace and got into the Pan family's carriage that he let out a sigh of relief. He looked at the 3 children and stood up to bow to them. There were thousands of words in his mind, but in the end, he only said, thank you. Hao supported him and said, there's no need for that. We're just returning the favor. The carriage went all the way to the Pan family. Pan Ning sent the 3 children back to the southern courtyard first, then hurriedly ran to find his grandfather, father, and eldest brother to tell them what had happened. In the Pan family's study, when they heard Pan Ning's words and saw the imperial edict spread out in front of them, the masters of the Pan family were all shocked speechless. They actually asked for such an imperial edict for them. This. The Pan family's patriarch looked at the imperial edict in shock. His heart was filled with indescribable gratitude and disbelief. I didn't expect them to really be immortals. Our Pan family is so lucky. Father Pan said excitedly. Even the usually calm Pan Hong was shocked when he saw the imperial edict. To the Pan family, this imperial edict was a treasure that couldn't be any more precious. 3 generations of the Pan family would be worry-free. This was no ordinary grace. Listen up. The Pan family's patriarch put away his shocked expression and took a deep breath. He looked at them and said, what happened today, other than us, can't be told to anyone else. Even your wives and children can't be told. Otherwise, there might be trouble. Keep this imperial edict carefully and pass it on to the next generation. Yes, we know. They also knew that this matter was not related to the little brother. His Majesty was still on the throne and under his protection, there was no need for them to use this imperial edict. However, the next emperor after 100 years might not be able to tolerate the Pan family. When that time came, this imperial edict would be a treasure that would protect the lives of the Pan family. Naturally, the fewer people who knew about this, the better. Keep the imperial edict in the secret compartment. Let's go and thank them. The Pan family patriarch said. All right, they replied. After putting away the imperial edict, they headed towards the south courtyard together. At this moment, in the southern courtyard, the 3 children were counting the treasures in their room with the door closed. Now that the golden toad demon was dead, the treasures that the golden toad demon had hidden naturally fell into their hands. Big brother, what can the Niden of this golden toad demon do? You asked while holding a pearl with faint golden radiance in her hand. This golden toad demon's Niden has the effect of detoxification. If you take a bowl of clear water and soak this bead in it, then the water will detoxify it. Hao said as he classified the treasures. Chapter 4505. A smile appeared on Hao's face and he said, yes, I also have the same plan. In addition to this inner core, you can pick out a few more things to give to them. Okay. The 2 of them answered and began to seriously choose. They couldn't compare to cultivators like them. Some magic treasures and the like needed to be activated with spiritual power and they couldn't use them. Even if they gave them to them, it would be useless. Therefore, they had to carefully choose what to give them. Young Master Hao, great-grandfather and the others are here. 17 reported from the courtyard. Hearing this, the three people in the room looked at each other and covered the things with blankets. They shouted for 17 to invite them in and went to the outer room to open the door. The father and son of the Pan family entered the room and told 17 to stand guard outside the courtyard before closing the door. They turned around and bowed to Hao, and the others. "Don't be like this," the three hurriedly said and went forward to support them. "Of course. Our Pan family is greatly indebted to you. This bow is necessary. Otherwise, we will feel uneasy," great-grandfather said and insisted on bowing again. Seeing this, the three children looked at each other and didn't stop them. After they bowed, they invited them to sit down. "I heard from Pan Ning that you are preparing to leave?" Great-grandfather asked and looked at the three children. From the first day he saw them, he knew that they weren't simple. Later on, he personally taught them how to read and write. He discovered that these three children were extraordinary, but he didn't expect that these three extraordinary children were actually immortals. "Yes, we are preparing. We will leave in a few days," Hao said. "Where are you going?" "Just the three of you. Why don't I send someone to send you there? It will be safer than the three of you going on the road," great-grandfather said. After all, in his opinion, they were still three children. "No need, great-grandfather. You and big brother are very powerful now," Yu said with a smile. She looked at her big brother and said crisply, "Big brother is also very powerful. Big brother will protect us." Looking at Yu, the expression on Hao's face softened a bit, and said to them, "At that time my strength was not restored, but now my strength is restored, so there won't be any problem in protecting them." As he spoke, he looked at Pan Hong and said, "Uncle Hong, I can't treat your leg, but if there's a chance in the future, we'll ask her to treat your leg." Pan Hong didn't expect him to still remember his legs. He immediately said, "It's okay. I'm fine like this. It's just a pair of legs. It's good enough that I'm still alive." They were not from the same world as them. It was only a pair of legs. How could he dare to trouble them to come from such a faraway place to treat him? They chatted for a while in the room, then got up and left. Because they said that they were not to be disturbed during their closed-door cultivation, the Pan family also gave the order not to disturb them. In the following days, Chi Bohu did visit them a few times, wanting to see them. However, he returned empty-handed time and time again. Half a month later, in the morning, the three children walked out of the courtyard. Yu said, "Big brother, let's go and say goodbye to big sister Shua and the others." Big brother said that they were going to leave today. They had already prepared the gifts, but before leaving, they still wanted to see their friends again. Chapter 45:06. The three of them went directly to the front yard and sat in the hall for a while. Pan family's old master and the others hurried over, followed by Bowen, Bo Qing, and Shua. "Little sister Yu, little brother Mu Chen, I haven't seen you for a long time. I missed you guys so much." Fu Qing, who looked like a tiger, saw them and jogged over to the two of them. "Why didn't you come out to play? Staying in the yard all day will make you stupid. Look, my father made me a wooden sword. It's so fun." He excitedly took out the small wooden sword from his waist and showed it to them. "I can practice swordsmanship with you in the future. I've been learning swordsmanship from my father these days." Looking at the excited and happy face of Fu Qing, Yu's face also overflowed with a smile, and her pair of beautiful big eyes blinked while looking at him. Reaching out her hand, she gestured and said with a beaming smile, "Big brother Fu Qing, you have grown taller again. Of course, I eat a bowl of rice for every meal." Bo Qing puffed out his chest and said, "Little sister Yu, are you coming to play with us today? We came to say goodbye to you today. We're leaving." Yu said and looked at him blankly. The smile on her face disappeared and she nervously grabbed his hand. What? You're leaving. Why are you leaving? Where are you going? Are you really leaving? Aren't you going to stay for a few more days? Bowen also came forward and looked at them with reluctance. I also don't want you to leave. Shui also grabbed Yu's hand, her eyes red. All right. Han family's old master said and looked at his children. Sit at the side. When the three children heard this, they obediently stood to the side. We're leaving today. Big brother brought us here to say goodbye to you. Mu Chen looked at the three of them, his little face still tense. He walked forward and took out 3 jade pendants and handed them to the three of them. This is a gift from the three of us. It's for you as a memento. When the adults of the Pan family saw this, they couldn't help but be startled. They hurriedly said, how can we accept this? This thing is too precious. The things they gave out were definitely immortal treasures. How could the three children accept such precious treasures? Yu said with a beaming smile, Big brother let us pick 3 gifts to give to Big brother Bo 1, Big brother Bo Qing and also Big sister Shui, so Big brother and I picked these 3 pendants. Take it. It's nothing valuable. Hao looked at the patriarch and said, we still have some things to tell you. Hearing this, the Pan family's father and son looked at each other. Only then did they accept the gifts for the 3 children. Then, they had them wait outside before closing the door. Hao handed over a box and said, this is the golden toad demon's Niden. Soak it in clear water and it will cure all poisons. Keep this Niden and don't let anyone know about it. He paused and said, we're giving these 3 things to Bo Qing and the others. It's best to tell them not to tell anyone about it, so as to avoid unnecessary trouble. This. The Pan family's father and son didn't expect that they would actually give them these treasures. For a moment, they didn't know whether to accept or not. Chapter 4507. Alright, then we'll accept it. We'll take good care of this treasure. Thank you very much. The old master said solemnly and put the small box into his arms. He thought for a while and said, the 3 of you are on the road. Even if you have good skills, I'm worried that there will be people with bad intentions. You have to have an adult by your side. He paused and thought for a while before saying, 17 has been by your side for more than a year. Why don't you let him go with you? If anything happens along the way, he can take care of it. If you reach a safe place and don't want him to stay, he can come back. If you want him to stay, he can stay by your side to take care of you. Hao thought for a while and nodded. Alright, let's let 17 follow us. When the Pan family saw this, they smiled. Pan Ming said, I'll prepare the carriage for you. Alright, Hao replied. After he left, Fu Qing and the others ran in again. Are you really leaving? Will you come back in the future? Bowen couldn't help but ask. They had been with their friends for more than a year. They thought that they would grow up with them here, but they didn't expect that they would suddenly leave. If there's a chance in the future, we'll come back, Hao said. When I become more powerful and no longer need anyone to follow me, I'll come back to see you. Yu said with a smile. Practice your martial arts and swordsmanship well. Don't be too weak. Mu Chen looked at Fu Qing and said. He wouldn't say that he was reluctant to part with him, but for a friend who had been with him for so long, he was still reluctant to part with him. When Fu Qing heard this, his eyes reddened and tears fell. Sob. Don't worry, I'll definitely practice my martial arts and swordsmanship well. When we meet again, I'll be able to beat you. Mu Chen's face was tense. He glanced at his crying face and said proudly, don't think about beating me. You won't be able to. The children were talking in the hall. First Madam and Second Madam, who hadn't been called, also came in. When the butler came to inform them that the carriage was ready, Hao, and the others bid farewell to them again. Safe journey, the Pan family members said as they sent them off. After watching them enter the carriage, Pan Ning said, "There's some food in the carriage for all of you. You can eat on the way." Then, he said worriedly, 17, take good care of them on the way. They will be your masters in the future. Yes. 17 replied. He looked at the people of the Pan family and said, 17 will protect the three masters. Under the reluctant gazes of the crowd, 17 slowly drove the carriage away. Watching the carriage slowly move away until it disappeared into the street, Fu Qing pulled his father's hand and looked up to ask, "Father, will they come back? Will we see them again in the future?" Pan Ning sighed in his heart. He picked up his son and looked into the distance. They are not the same as us. Immortals and mortals were different. To be able to interact with each other for so long and form such good karma was already something unimaginable. Chapter 4508. It was also good that they left. The city was abuzz with the news. Only after they left would they be forgotten after a long time. In another world, Xianyuan and Fengjiu were resting by the sea. Looking at the endless sea in front of them, Fengjiu held his cheek with one hand and said, "We have almost searched this world. It seems that we have to change to another world. But this time, which world should we choose to search?" Xianyuan pondered and said, "Chen, and you, were unable to awaken their contracted beasts because of the blood curse. However, Hao has the silver wolf and his own talent is high. Perhaps he has already broken through the blood curse and recovered. But there has been no news of them for so long. Could it be that they are unable to contact us where they are? Otherwise, with Hao's intelligence, he will definitely find a way to let us know where they are." "You mean, could they be in the mortal world?" Fengjiu was startled and looked at him in surprise. "We can't rule out this possibility." Xianyuan nodded and said, "The place that Tianjizi pointed to is a place in the lower realm. In the past 2 years, we've only searched the realm of immortals, but we've rarely checked the realm of mortals. What if they're really in the realm of mortals? With the three children's strength, if they go to such a place and don't have the transmission scroll with them, they can't go back to the immortal world at all." Hearing this, Fengjiu quickly took out the map to check and excluded some places. Finally, he circled an area and said, "This area is all the mortal world. It's just that the spiritual aura of this place is very weak and almost no immortal cultivators will set foot in it. However, the terrain is very wide. Even if we search one by one, I'm afraid it will take at least 2 to 3 years. Since there is a direction, we have to try no matter what. However, don't be too anxious. At least we know that the 3 children are safe now." Xianyuan held her hand and said, "Yes, I know. Don't worry. It's been so long, and I've adjusted my mentality." Tianjizi also said that one day, we'll meet them again. Fengjiu smiled and exhaled softly. "Yesterday, I sent a message back to my father and the others, telling them not to worry too much. My brother even asked where we are now." She paused for a moment before continuing, "I also sent a message to Du Fan and the others to return and stop searching everywhere. However, they said that they had nothing to do when they returned, so they asked me about the relevant information. I told them what Tianjizi told me, and I reckon that they will also search in this direction. Since that's the case, let's have them search the mortal realm." Xianyuan looked at her and said, "With more people searching, perhaps we can find them earlier. Although you've been running around, I can see that your cultivation seems to be fluctuating. Are you going to advance again?" Fengjiu asked. He inexplicably thought of the words that Tianjizi said the other day and felt a little worried. There are so many immortal cultivators in this world, but I've never heard of anyone stepping into the supreme level. Xianyuan smiled and said, "What's more, you and I are advancing at lightning speed. Even if we're at the peak of the Divine King realm, it's not easy to step into the supreme level. Chapter 4509. Hearing this, Xianyuan Mose smirked. Don't worry. Even if I advance, I'll be fine. Furthermore, we haven't found the children yet. Where would we find the time to stop and refine pills and advance? Fengjiu wanted to say something, but he held her hand and stood up. Let's go to the mortal world to look for them. He waved his hand and a whirlpool appeared beside him. Then, he led her into the whirlpool. As the two disappeared into the whirlpool also disappeared in the air as if it had never appeared. 3 months later, in the evening, a carriage was moving along the mountain road. Seeing that there was no one around, 17, who was driving the carriage, raised his guard. Seeing that the sky was gradually darkening, 17 said to the 3 people in the carriage, "Young Master Hao, it's getting dark. Shall we find a place to rest for the night? Shall we continue tomorrow?" In the carriage, Mu Chen held a night pearl in his hand and shone it on the side. Yu sat obediently at the side and didn't make a fuss. Hao sat between the two of them and was looking at a map. Hearing 17's words, Hao moved his hand on the map and said, "No need. Continue along this road and stop when we reach the end." "Yes." 17 replied respectfully and continued to drive the carriage forward. "Big brother, is there no road here?" Mu Chen pointed at the place on the map and asked. "No, it's just that after we reach here, the carriage can't move. We have to walk. Look here, as long as we cross these mountains, we can reach this sea area. The floating Fate Immortal Island is on the other side of this sea area." Hao looked at the map and taught them to look at it. In the carriage, Hao set up a soundproof enchantment and explained some things to Mu Chen and Mu Yu in detail. When the sky darkened and the carriage stopped, he removed the enchantment with a wave of his hand and lifted the curtain at the same time. "Young Master Hao, there's no road ahead." 17 looked at the pitch-black darkness in front of him and looked around worriedly. As night fell, he could faintly hear the roars of wild beasts. Hao and the other two alighted from the carriage one after another. After looking around, Hao walked forward but was stopped by 17. "Young Master Hao, you can't go any further. There's a cliff in front." 17 hurriedly reminded him, worried that he would accidentally fall. The carriage continued to climb along the mountain path until there was no road left. However, it was still on top of a cliff. "Let's rest here tonight. We'll leave tomorrow." Hao then turned to Mu Chen and Mu Yu. "You two go back to the carriage and rest. I'll go pick up some branches to start a fire. It won't be too cold at night." As 17 spoke, she was about to head into the forest. Unexpectedly, Hao shook his head. "It's already dark. There should be a lot of wild beasts around here. You shouldn't go." He looked at 17 and said, "We've been on this journey for 3 months. We're not far from our destination. Do you want to go back, or do you want to come with us?" 17 left the Pan family and the 3 masters are already 17's masters. 17 will naturally follow the masters. "How can I go back?" he hurriedly said. Chapter 45:10. Seeing this, 17 looked at him uneasily and nervously, worried that he would chase him away. "You've been with us for almost 2 years. You should know that we're immortal cultivators, and you're just a mortal. The place we're going to is a place where immortal cultivators live. It's very difficult for mortals to survive there. Moreover, there are many dangers around us. If you follow us, who knows when you'll die in the hands of an immortal cultivator." Hao looked at him and analyzed the pros and cons. "If you leave now, I can give you a treasure. If you return to the Pan family, you can live a peaceful life. However, if you come with us, I can't guarantee your safety. After all, I still have my brother and sister to protect." There are many times when I won't be able to take care of you. So, you have to think carefully. 17 thought for a moment and asked, Young Master, how, are there no mortals in the place where the immortals live? Of course not. Not everyone can become immortals. Those without spiritual roots are mortals. It's just that it's hard for mortals to survive in a place where the immortals live. 17 wants to follow the three masters. He said firmly. When we get there, Young Master, how, you don't have to worry about 17. 17 will not cause you any trouble. 17 can take care of Young Master Chen and Miss Yu's daily life and follow them to protect them. In his opinion, Young Master Hao was very powerful, but Mu Chen and Mu Yu were only 4 years old. They still needed an adult to take care of them. Yu looked at 17 and then at her brother. She smiled and said, Brother, let 17 follow us. With him, I won't need you to accompany me when I go out. All right. Hao replied and looked at 17. Tonight, I'll tell you about some places in the immortal cultivation world. Listen carefully and remember it. When we get there, we have to be careful and keep a low profile. Yes. 17 couldn't help but be delighted and a smile appeared on his face. That night, Mu Chen and Mu Yu slept comfortably in the carriage while Hao talked to 17 the whole night. When the sky brightened, Hao walked forward and looked at the distance between the clouds. The place where they stood was about 70 to 80 meters away from the cliff on the opposite side. Moreover, there was mist in the air, so they couldn't see clearly. Hao had to use his divine sense to find out the distance. After waking Mu Chen and Mu Yu up and having some food, Hao took out the aircraft. With a toss of his hand, the aircraft grew bigger in front of them. Come up. Hao shouted and got them to sit on the aircraft. Then, the aircraft flew towards the cliff on the other side. This was the first time 17 was flying in the air on a flying device. Even though he was a grown man, his face was still pale with fright. Both of his hands were tightly gripping the edges of the flying device. 17's face turned pale from fright. Yu was all smiles as she looked at his nervous face. She herself wasn't afraid, instead she was very curious as she looked all around. She and her brother had aircraft too. However, Big Brother had instructed him not to take it out casually. Chapter 45:11. When he stood on the ground, 17's legs were weak, and his face was slightly pale. He never thought that he would fly in the sky one day. That kind of excitement made his hair stand on end, even though he had undergone special training. Looking at the three little masters, each one more calm than the other, he couldn't help but feel that he was really too useless. Hao looked at the endless sea in front of him and said, Let's rest first. The floating Fate Immortal Island is on the other side of the sea, but it's a little far away. Big Brother, are we still going to take the flying device? Yu asked. Yes, we can only go there by flying device. Hao nodded and looked at them. Let's rest first and eat something. He turned to 17 and asked, Are you okay? Young Master Hao, don't worry. I'm fine. It was his first time flying in the sky, so he wasn't used to it yet. However, he would get used to it after a while. They rested by the sea for a while. After noon, Hao continued to take them to the surface of the sea in the aircraft, preparing to cross the seemingly endless sea. Even though the aircraft was flying in the air, it was only early in the morning of the next day that they could faintly see the land that appeared in their line of sight. I see it, young Master Hao. It's the land in front. 17 said with some surprise. Looking at the land in front of them, his eyes were filled with excitement. It turned out that the place where immortal cultivators lived was so far away from where mortals lived. If it weren't for the aircraft, mortals wouldn't have been able to come to such a place, let alone see the land hidden on the other side of the sea. In the morning light, Hao's aircraft slowly landed in a forest on the side of the land. He put away the aircraft and looked at the surrounding environment. When we're here, you must be vigilant and careful. Yes, 17 replied. Okay. Mu Chen and Mu Yu also responded. Seeing him take out the map and check it, Mu Chen asked, Big brother, are we in the forest now? Why don't we use the aircraft to fly out of here? Hao Er looked at the map and frowned. This map only shows how to get to the floating Fate Immortal Island. As for the route here, it's blank. The Golden Toad Demon probably never left, so it wasn't drawn. He raised his head to look at Mu Chen. Moreover, if the aircraft is seen by those who are stronger than us, it's hard to guarantee that they won't be greedy for it. That's why it's best to avoid using it when we're here. Hearing this, they nodded and came to a realization. We came here mainly to find out how to get back. Now that we're here and in this forest, it's a good opportunity to bring you guys to gain experience in this forest and increase your combat power. Hao Er looked at them as he spoke. He put away the map and led them into the forest. This was a training forest. Back then, the Golden Toad Demon had cultivated here for 500 years. Therefore, there were many ferocious beasts and demonic beasts here. In the early morning forest, the faint roars of ferocious beasts could be heard, as well as the chirping of birds on the branches. 3 children and an adult were shuttling through the forest where the weeds were half the height of a person. It was a very strange scene. Roar. Chapter 45:12. Be careful. 17 cried out in alarm. Shielding the 2 little ones behind him, he pulled out the sword from his waist and slashed towards that huge tusked boar. Clang! However, when he slashed with his sword, it made a clanging sound as if he was slashing an iron plate. The hand holding the sword was shaken to the point of pain. Just when he was in a daze, he saw Mu Chen leaping up. His small body directly sat on the back of that tusked boar. The dagger in his hand was filled with a breath that was visible to the naked eye, and with a speed that was too fast for the ears to cover, he stabbed towards the bottom of its neck. Whoosh! Roar! The sharp blade pierced through and was fiercely pulled out. Fresh blood spurted out like a pillar of blood. The wild tusked boar howled miserably and fiercely flung away the small figure riding on its back. Seeing Mu Chen being thrown away, Hao Er's heart was raised. He wanted to go forward to help, but he forcefully restrained himself. This was only a low-level ordinary beast. If they couldn't even defeat this ordinary beast, then there was no need to talk about any experience. Brother, be careful. Yu softly called out. Seeing him being thrown down, and that beast once again bumping towards the direction where he was thrown, she hurriedly rushed forward. At the same time, she pulled out her dagger and at the same time, her small figure actually drilled towards the bottom of that beast, directly stabbing upwards from below. Hao didn't expect that she would actually be so daring. He was so scared that his whole body was covered in cold sweat. He took a step forward, but when he saw her stabbing the neck of that beast with her dagger, blood splashing all over her body, he stopped in his tracks. However, his heart was in his throat. Only when he saw her drilled out from under that beast and retreated, did he finally relax. When Mu Chen was thrown away, he jumped high in the air. His small body somersaulted in midair and steadily landed on the ground. When he saw his little sister drilled under that beast without any regard for her life, he was so scared that his face turned pale. Roar! That tusked boar howled. Because of the 2 daggers stabbing its vital points, blood gushed out. Following the loss of blood, its 4 hooves were somewhat weak. Its huge body swayed and hit a tree at the side, crushing it before it got up again. When Mu Chen saw this, he immediately rode up and dug out the crystal core from the beast's head. As the crystal core was dug out, the huge beast also fell with a loud crash. Bang! A heavy sound rang out, and even the ground shook slightly. Hao looked at this scene and at the same time, at his brother and sisters full of satisfaction and joy. Although the two of them were only 4 years old, their courage and insight had been honed. They were also very agile. With their strength and their small bodies, it was already very impressive for them to be able to kill this low-level tusked boar. Compared to Hao's, 17 was stunned. He says of his heart, SSSSSS. Was this really something a 3 or 4-year-old child could do? Big brother, we can protect ourselves when we encounter danger. Chapter 45:13. Looking at them, 17 couldn't help but swallow his saliva. He only knew that the two little masters in front of him had really refreshed his worldview and understanding. In contrast, the skills and fighting strength he was so proud of were actually too weak compared to them. Thinking that he couldn't even compare to a 4-year-old child, he couldn't help but burst into tears. As it turned out, he was the one who should be protected. Only heaven knew that he had been protecting these two little masters all along the way, but now, he suddenly felt so useless. What should he do? "Miss you, Master Chen, why are you so powerful?" he faintly asked, looking as if he had suffered a blow. Because we were personally taught by Big Brother. Big Brother told us that when dealing with a ferocious beast, we have to attack its fatal points. Yu said with a smile. Looking at 17, she said, "This boar is a low-level ferocious beast, but it's a metal-attributed ferocious beast. Its skin is very hard and also very sturdy. Cutting its skin won't hurt it. You can only attack below its neck. That's its fatal point. Only by attacking its fatal point can you kill it." 17's eyes lit up. "So that's how it is. 17, cut some meat from this boar and roast it. The ferocious beast's meat has a spiritual aura. Eating it can strengthen one's body." Hao said, letting him cut some meat from the boar first. "Yes." 17 hurriedly responded. Hao walked forward and came to Yu's side. With a cold face, he said, "Yu, do you know that what you did just now was very dangerous? If you didn't dodge from under that boar, do you know that you would have been trampled to death?" Yu lowered her head and whispered, "But, I could have dodged." "Then what if you couldn't?" Hao's face was stiff, and his voice was cold. "No matter what you do, you can't put yourself in danger. Haven't I taught you before?" Hearing this, Yu's head hung even lower. She held the dagger in her hand and whispered, "Big brother, I'm sorry. Yu knows her mistake. Yu won't do it again. Little sister, do you know that you scared me just now? What if you were trampled to death? It would be ugly to be trampled to death." Mu Chen also said with a cold face, putting on the airs of an older brother. "I'll be careful in the future. I won't do it again," she said softly. Hao's expression eased up when he saw this, and he said, "All right, the blood on your body will attract other ferocious beasts. See if there's a water source nearby and wash yourself clean first." He turned around and looked at 17, who was squatting on the ground and cutting the meat with his back facing them. He walked up to him and looked. The corner of his mouth couldn't help but twitch. The tusked boar that weighed more than 1,000 kilograms was actually skinned by the knife in his hand. That scene was truly a little frightening. "Young Master Hao, we don't need this pig skin. I cut off 2 hind legs. If we use these 2 hind legs to roast, it should be enough for us to eat for a few days." 17 dragged the 2 hind legs to her side. Hao thought for a moment and took out a qianquan bag from his space. He put the 2 pig legs inside and said, "Let's find a water source first and wash the bloodstains." "All right." Chapter 45:14. They continued to walk forward and found a water source. They washed the blood off their bodies and changed their clothes. Then, they found a place to sit down and rest. 17. This is the introductory mantra for cultivation. Try to cultivate it. See if you can condense spiritual energy. Hao handed him a mantra. Because he did not have spiritual energy, he could not even open his heaven-earth bag. It was very inconvenient to walk in this forest without a heaven-earth bag. Thus, he gave him the introductory mantra to try. At his age, it would be very difficult for him to cultivate. However, regardless of whether he had any cultivation, as long as he could condense spiritual energy and sense the existence of spiritual energy, he could use the heaven-earth bag. Young Master Hao, is this for me? I can cultivate it too. 17 was so excited that he could not find his words. He could not believe that he would give him something like this. This is a more common introductory mantra in the cultivation world. As long as you can condense spiritual energy, you can use the heaven-earth bag in the future. Try it. Hao placed the mantra in his hand and said, also, eat more ferocious beast meat. It's good for you. Yes, thank you, young Master Hao. 17 immediately stood up and knelt down on one knee. Oh right, I also wanted to ask you. I saw that your dissection technique was a little different. Have you learned it before? Hao looked at him strangely. Thinking about the scene of flesh and bone returning to bone, he felt a little strange. Hearing this, 17 grinned and said, in the future, when I train in the Dark Guard camp, I will be in charge of the food for the Dark Guards for a period of time. I have killed thousands of pigs, so I know how to deal with those beasts. Hearing this, Hao could not help but purse his lips. All right. So he was doing the work of slaughtering pigs in the Dark Guard camp. They rested in the forest. 17 also seized the time to memorize the mantra and cultivate according to Hao's instructions. At night, they roasted meat and found a relatively safe place to rest. They prepared to rest until they had enough energy to continue tomorrow. 17 was responsible for keeping watch at night. At the same time, he also tried to draw energy into his body. However, after a day, he did not gain anything. However, after eating the barbecued meat, he felt a warm current surging in his body. Thus, he tried again. That night, he tried again and again. One morning 8 days later, 17 shouted in surprise, "Young Master Hao, I think I've already drawn qi into my body." Hao was a little surprised. He glanced at him and nodded. That's right. You're indeed drawing qi into your body. You're a little fast. His tone was a little strange, and his gaze was somewhat sizing him up. One had to know that it would take at least 10 days to half a month for an average person to draw qi into their body. Some might even take a few months. However, he only took 7 or 8 days. Could it be that 17 was a good seedling for cultivation? Hao guessed in his heart and sized him up. Then, he handed him a qiankuan bag. This is for you. You can store things in the future. Thank you, young Master Hao. 17 happily took it and looked at it carefully. It was just a small and inconspicuous bag, but he had seen them take out a lot of things from it. Chapter 45:15. Okay, the two answered and nodded. After tidying up, they followed him forward. 17 walked in front, using the sword in his hand to cut down the weeds that were half the height of a person to make a path. At the same time, he used the sword to slap the surrounding weeds to prevent poisonous snakes from escaping. They had lived in this area for 7 or 8 days and were quite familiar with the surroundings. They knew that if they wanted to leave this place, they had to leave this area that they were familiar with first before they could find a way out. After walking in the woods for a long time, it was almost noon. They were about to find a place to rest when they heard rustling sounds around them. They looked around vigilantly and saw a few figures darting out from the trees and surrounding them. Who is it? 17 shouted. He held the sword in his hand and looked vigilantly at the people who suddenly appeared around them. However, when he saw the powerful aura emitted from those people and the strong smell of blood, his heart couldn't help but jump slightly. He was a little nervous and worried. The people surrounding them were all strong and had a fierce look on their faces. The murderous aura emitted from them was so intimidating. He, who had lived on the edge of the knife, was no stranger to that murderous aura. However, he was worried that if a fight broke out, even if young Master Hao was skilled, they would not be a match for these people. Big brother, it's actually a few children and a guard who has just drawn qi into his body. A man with a scar on his face said in surprise as he stared at Hao, and the others. A one-eyed man with a long sword hanging at his waist walked out. His sharp and vicious gaze swept past 17, directly ignoring her. Then, it landed on Hao, Mu Chen, and Mu Yu, sizing them up. Children. He narrowed his eyes and stared at them. Where did you come from? Who did you come with? Hao looked at the man and used his body to protect Mu Chen and Mu Yu behind him. His cold little face was indifferent and expressionless. He said, "We got separated from our family and lost our way here." Oh. Is that so? The one-eyed man stared at him. Suddenly, his gaze swept toward 17, who was at the side. He released his pressure and enveloped 17. His voice was gloomy and filled with viciousness. "Tell me, where did you guys come from? Why would he appear here? Tell me the truth, or I'll kill you." Bang! Under the pressure of the other party, 17 knelt down without any resistance. His face turned pale in an instant. He only felt a powerful force pressing down on him, making it impossible for him to stand up straight. Even breathing was difficult for him. Fortunately, after that person's voice fell, the pressure on his body retracted a little, allowing him to catch his breath. 17. You softly called, and somewhat worriedly looked at him. Hao protected Mu Chen and Mu Yu as he stared vigilantly at the people around them, in case they suddenly attacked. With his brother and sister's skills, they could still deal with low-level ferocious beasts, but if they were to face these people, they would not even have a chance to fight back. We've definitely been separated from our families, and I'm the only one left with the 3 young masters. Seniors, we've only come here because we've lost our way. Please be magnanimous. He clasped his fists and said. Chapter 45:16. Judging from your extraordinary bearing at such a young age, I'm sure you're not from an ordinary family. Since you've lost your way here, you'll have to follow us. Once we're out of here, we'll inform your families and let them bring you back. 17's heart sank when he heard this. With his experience, he naturally knew what these people meant. This was clearly an attempt to control them. Once they were out of the forest, their families would pay the ransom to ransom them. He couldn't help but look at Hao, wanting to know what he meant. If that's the case, then many thanks. Hao looked at the one-eyed man and said, "When we get home, we'll definitely let our parents thank all of you." He revealed a relieved smile, as if he was happy that they were willing to escort them out of the city. Yu blinked and asked innocently, "Big brother, does that mean we don't have to be afraid of those frightening beasts anymore? With uncle and the rest protecting us, we won't be eaten by the beasts, right?" "Yes, they're very powerful. If we follow them, we won't be eaten by the beasts." Hao looked back at the 2 of them and said. 17 heard their words and understood Hao's meaning. He immediately cupped his hands and said to the man, "Thank you, senior. We'll have to trouble you all along the way." "No problem." The one-eyed man curled the corner of his mouth, revealing a fake smile. He glanced at the 3 children, then raised his hand and waved. The burly men surrounding them with swords put away their swords and surrounded them, preventing them from escaping. Hao brought Mu Chen and Mu Yu with him, while 17 walked behind them. Seeing that they didn't seem to want to rest, Hao said to 17, "17, you is very tired. Carry her on your back." "Yes." 17 replied and squatted down. "Miss Yu, I'll carry you." Seeing her big brother was looking at her, obediently lied down on his back, then hugging 17's neck, she comfortably lied down on his back to rest. Chen, are you tired? Hao looked at Mu Chen beside him and asked. Mu Chen shook his head and struggled to follow her with his short legs. I can walk by myself. Hearing this, Hao revealed a smile and said, if you can't walk anymore, just tell me and I'll carry you. The one-eyed man in front glanced back at them and continued to walk. After walking for a while, he suddenly raised his hand and stopped. Alert! As soon as his voice fell, the roar of a beast could be heard. Roar! Roar! They were two powerful ferocious beasts. They bared their sharp fangs and lowered their bodies as they roared at them. The deafening roar carried the pressure of the ferocious beasts, causing the surrounding low-level ferocious beasts to flee in all directions. Hao was protecting Mu Chen and 17, who was carrying Mu Yu. His calm gaze swept across the two beasts before he looked at the one-eyed man. At the same time, he retreated until he was under a big tree and stopped to watch. These people seemed to be used to dealing with these vicious beasts. They didn't show any fear or panic. Instead, under the command of the one-eyed man, the group of more than a dozen people quickly surrounded the two vicious beasts and attacked them together. Chapter 45:17. While those people were fighting and not paying attention to them, 17 lowered her voice and asked, Young Master Hao, what should we do? Run now. We can't run now. Hao said in a low voice while paying attention to the people in front of them. He said, that one-eyed guy has been staring at us. We can't escape now. If we do, we'll offend them and they'll want to kill us. Let's wait for an opportunity. He paused and lowered his voice again. Before that, we have to lower their guard. When the time is right, it won't be too late to run. Okay. Mu Chen and Mu Yu responded in a low voice. Those people's fighting power was very strong and they cooperated well with each other. It didn't take long for the two beasts to be killed. Hao, and the others watched. They dug out the beast crystals and gave them to the one-eyed man. The others began to deal with the two beasts, cutting off the valuable parts and putting them in their cosmos bags. Hao had some thoughts in his mind, so he was also observing the fighting power of these people. Among these people, except for the one-eyed man who was in the golden core stage, the others were in the foundation establishment stage. He didn't know what kind of existence these people were in this place. He also didn't know how strong a golden core stage cultivator was in this place. One had to know that because they wanted to keep a low profile and try their best not to cause any trouble or danger, the three of them had concealed their strength just so that they could use this kind of low profile to save their lives when they encountered danger. Actually, in this situation, it wasn't that they had no way to escape from these people's control. After all, he still had a powerful silver wolf in the space. If he summoned it out, let alone these people, even if there were a few more batches, they wouldn't be a match for the silver wolf. However, unless it was really necessary, he couldn't let others know about the silver wolf's existence. Moreover, he wanted to use these people to lead the way so that they could leave this forest. If Xianyuan Mose and Fengjiu were here and knew all this, they would be proud of Hao's intelligence and calmness. Even if he was only about 10 years old, he could calmly analyze the pros and cons and make the most correct plan. Their teachings were not in vain. You guys, come over here. The one-eyed man called out, beckoning Hao and the others over. Seeing this, Hao and the others walked over and stood beside him. You used to go out with your elders to catch ferocious beasts. The one-eyed man's gaze fell on Hao and then glanced at the two little ones. No. Hao shook his head. No. He sneered, looked at the three of them, and said, You look young, but your mouths are full of lies. Moreover, you don't even blink when you lie. If it weren't for me, I would have thought that I was deceived by you. Hao looked at him and didn't say anything, waiting for him to explain himself. Two high-level ferocious beasts. Even if an adult saw them, they would turn pale and panic. But the few of you didn't even make a sound. You've been hiding under the trees and watching quietly since just now. I don't see any of you being frightened. Chapter 45:18. Hao pursed his lips when he heard that. So that was the case. 17 was also taken aback. They had been in the forest for the past 7 or 8 days. Other than the first time he cried out in fright, he rarely saw young Master Hao, young Master Chen, and Miss Yu scream in fright. Most of the time, young Master Hao was expressionless, while the two little ones looked even more excited. He was already used to their reactions. Now that he heard the one-eyed man's words, he was shocked to realize that their reactions were indeed a little abnormal in the eyes of these people. This 17's heart skipped a beat. She hurriedly opened her mouth with some embarrassment and said with an embarrassed smile, "It's like this. Our young Master Hao has never had any expression on his face since he was young. Even if he was afraid, he wouldn't show it. Little young Master and little Miss are only 4 years old. Moreover, weren't the various seniors present? It's only because the seniors are here that we can be at ease." This explanation was reasonable. When the one-eyed man heard this, he glanced at the guard called 17 and then looked at the two little ones. He saw the little boy's face was tense and his little lips were pursed as he stared at him fearlessly. His appearance was just like a little tiger. The little girl on 17's back was also blinking her clear eyes and looking at him blankly. Perhaps it was because lying on 17's back was very relaxing and comfortable, the little girl yawned and rubbed her eyes. Her little face looked a little sleepy. Could it be that he was really paranoid? The one-eyed man looked at the expressionless little boy again. Seeing that little face, it seemed that it was really as 17 said. He had facial paralysis. That better be the case. If I find out what tricks you are up to, I will not let you off easily. The one-eyed man warned in a gloomy voice. Then, he looked at his subordinates and ordered, "Move quickly." The group set off again and quickly left this place that was stained with the smell of blood. As they walked in the forest, suddenly, they heard voices and footsteps ahead. Hao and the rest looked ahead and saw a group of mercenaries of about 30 people. They stopped when they saw the one-eyed man and the others. The leader went forward to greet them. "Ha ha ha, it's Brother Darkwood. I didn't expect to meet you here." That mercenary leader seemed to know him. He went up and greeted him with a smile. At the same time, he used his hand to pat his shoulder. His gaze swept over, and when he saw Hao and the others following behind, he was slightly surprised. "Brother Darkwood, why are there such young children in your team?" "Hee, we met them on the way here. When we get out of here, their families will come and take them back," the one-eyed man said as he glanced back at Hao and the others. "These children are quite good-looking, and their temperament is not bad either. They should be the children of some big family. Congratulations, Brother Heimu. This time, you've earned a lot of money again." "Ha ha 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 ha." That person clasped his hands together and laughed. Chapter 45:19. The two men thought that Hao and the rest didn't hear what they were talking about, or that they weren't afraid of being heard. After all, in their eyes, they didn't pose a threat at all. After the two of them chatted for a while, the man cupped his fists and took his leave. He led his team in another direction. On this side, the one-eyed man in front led them forward again. It was not until evening that they found a place to rest in the forest. As night fell, the air became colder. These people didn't light a fire. Instead, they all jumped on trees not far away to rest. Hao and the rest were also carried up the tree. A man stared at them and said, "Don't move. If you fall from here, you'll break your limbs even if you don't die. Hao, and 17 stayed by Mu Chen and Mu Yu's side to prevent them from falling or being bitten by insects. We still have some roasted meat left from yesterday. Although it's a little hard, we can still make do with it. 17 took out some jerky from her Cosmos bag and gave it to them. The three of them took it and sat on the tree to eat while looking at the people in the surrounding trees. Those people looked like they were casually finding a place to rest, but they were guarding this place tightly. Having lived here for 7 to 8 days, they naturally knew that at night, the trees were safer than below. However, it didn't mean that there was no danger in the trees. After all, there were occasionally poisonous snakes coiled around the branches, ready to take their lives at any time. Sitting high up, they could faintly see a flickering fire in the distance. Obviously, there were people resting in the distance. As the night deepened, two men used the excuse of relieving themselves to quietly head over there to see who was there. However, not long after they left, the one-eyed man and his subordinates on the tree heard the clanging of swords and sabers as well as a blood-curdling screech. Almost instinctively, the one-eyed man, who was only a few meters away from Hao, and the rest, quickly jumped up. With a gloomy gaze, he rushed up and shouted sternly, "Follow me to take a look." Yes. Those people responded and quickly followed. After a while, only Hao, and 17 were left. The two people from before should have been killed, 17 said. As 17 spoke, she stood on the tree and looked at the flames in the distance. The originally tranquil forest became chaotic as the sounds of battle spread. "Big brother, should we go and take a look?" Yu asked softly. She also looked into the distance like 17. However, she was small and couldn't see anything. She only heard the clanging of swords and screams in the forest. "Let's go later to avoid being accidentally injured by the sword aura," Hao said and asked them to wait while carefully listening to the movement in front of them. The sounds of battle continued for quite a while, accompanied by screams from time to time. They couldn't see it from where they were, but when they heard the screams, they tensed up and zest. Chapter 45-20. Blood seeped out of the one-eyed man's body and dripped down. As he approached, the smell of blood in the air became heavier. Seeing the murderous aura on his body, Hao shielded Mu Chen and Mu Yu behind him. 18 brothers, all dead. Little brat, you can go to hell too. The one-eyed man's gloomy voice sounded. The next moment, his body flew down from above like a bat. He reached out to strangle Hao's neck, ready to strangle them all here. His men were killed by those mercenaries, and it would be troublesome to bring these brats out. It was better to strangle them here and let him vent his anger. Seeing the rising murderous aura on his body, Hao's eyes turned cold and he shouted, "Back off." As soon as his voice fell, his hand moved and a long sword appeared in his hand. With a surge of thought, his hidden strength burst out in an instant. Whoosh! Taking advantage of the moment when his strength burst forth, the sharp sword in his hand pierced towards the chest of the attacking figure with a speed that was too fast for one to cover one's ears. The speed of the sword was so fast and fierce that even the one-eyed man who had experienced hundreds of battles couldn't react in time. Hiss! Because of that moment of distraction, he missed the opportunity to avoid the sword and only saw the long sword pierce his chest with a whoosh. This is impossible. His eyes widened in shock and he looked in disbelief at the little boy in front of him who was only about 10 years old but had the strength of a golden core cultivator. He couldn't believe that he could have such fast reaction speed and instantly stab his fatal spot with a sword. The moment Hao shouted, 17 quickly retreated with Mu Chen and Mu Yu. At the same time, she protected them behind her, just in case. After Hao's sword stabbed down, he condensed spiritual power in his palm and fiercely attacked. When it hit the one-eyed man's body with a heavy bang, the sword in his chest was pulled back, and at the same time, a column of blood flowed out. Pfft! The one-eyed man, who was originally injured from the encirclement, originally wanted to kill these few brats to vent his anger while escaping, but unexpectedly, he fell into the hands of these brats that he didn't even care about at all. Howard's face was cold as he watched the one-eyed man stumble backward with blood flowing from his mouth. He was about to die. He held the sword in his hand and gathered his spiritual energy. He raised it again and the sword flashed. A cold light slashed across the one-eyed man's neck. Swish! The faint sound of sword chi dissipated in the air, and the figure who was leaning against the tree was frozen in place. His eyes were wide open and filled with shock. A trace of blood seeped out from his throat and slid down bit by bit until the last trace of life in his body disappeared. He stood there stiffly, staring straight ahead. "Young Master Hao, there are people coming from over there," 17 shouted in a low voice. She was a little worried as she looked at the numerous figures rushing in their direction. Hao glanced in that direction and retreated sideways. He came in front of Mu Chen and Mu Yu, holding the long sword in his hand to protect them. He made a vigilant posture and suppressed his strength at the same time. A few figures shuttled through the forest. When they passed by, the leaves rustled. One of them could faintly hear someone shouting, "Hurry up! He's right in front. Don't let him escape." Chapter 45-21. You killed him. One of the men, who was in his 20s, looked at the little boy, who had a cold expression on his face. His eyes were filled with disbelief. This kid looked no more than 10 years old, right? He actually killed the one-eyed man. Howard stared at the three people in front of him, and a dark light flashed across his eyes. Two of them were mid-foundation establishment cultivators, and the middle-aged man was a golden core cultivator. He thought for a while, and under the questioning and astonished gazes of the three people, he glanced at the badges on their mercenary uniforms and said, "You are mercenaries." The middle-aged man put away his astonishment and looked at these people. His gaze swept past 17, who was wearing a guard's uniform, and then looked at the two small figures behind her. He frowned, and finally his gaze landed on the little boy, who was about 10 years old, and said, "As you can see, we are indeed mercenaries." Hearing this, Hao pointed his sword at the dead one-eyed man and said coldly, "I killed this man. I'll give you all his valuables as a reward for hiring you to escort us out of the forest." Hearing this, the middle-aged man raised his eyebrows and stared at the little boy. He was very curious. What kind of family raised this child? At such a young age, he had the courage to not panic in the face of danger, and he could even handle things so calmly. "You're so shameless, kid. This person was clearly heavily injured by us. Otherwise, how could you have killed him with your strength?" The man beside him snorted coldly. He felt that this person's valuables should belong to their mercenary team. Howard's gaze landed on that person, and he said, "He died under my sword." When the young man heard this, he couldn't help but be annoyed. Just as he was about to speak, the middle-aged man raised his hand to signal for him to stop. "Even if what you said is the truth, that you killed this person and the property belongs to you, we can still kill you and the property will naturally belong to us. There's no need for us to escort you out of the forest, right?" The middle-aged man smirked as he stared at Hao. Hao looked at the middle-aged man and said unhurriedly, "A mercenary team that has been certified by the Mercenary Guild wouldn't choose to kill and rob under normal circumstances. Moreover, you can get a large sum of money from this person by protecting our children. You won't lose out." Hearing that, the middle-aged man smiled. "I can see that you're not from an ordinary family, all right? I'll make the decision and accept your mission." "Vice Commander." A young man next to him shouted in disapproval. "It doesn't matter. We're going back anyway. Besides, they're just a few kids. Let's just take them along." As the middle-aged man spoke, he gestured, "Go, take everything from the one-eyed man." "Yes." The two men responded and stepped forward. After taking all the items from the man's body, they stood beside him. "Where are you going?" the middle-aged man said and turned to walk back. Hao Er and the rest followed from a distance behind. Mu Chen lowered his voice and asked, "Big brother, can these people be trusted?" Chapter 45-22. Hearing this, they nodded and made a mental note. They walked forward and after a while, they came to the place where the bonfire was lit. There was still the smell of blood around. The corpses on the ground had obviously been disposed of. There were no corpses around, only some bloodstains. More than 30 mercenaries were either standing or sitting around talking. Among the mercenaries, there were a few young men and women. "Old Zheng, how was it? Did you catch the person?" Another middle-aged man saw them come back and asked. His gaze turned and landed on 17 and the few children behind them with some surprise. "Where did this child come from? And he's so young." The middle-aged man frowned and stared at Mu Chen and Mu Yu, then at Hao Er, and finally at 17. He saw that this man who looked like a guard was actually a young cultivator who had just drawn qi into his body not long ago. "Haha, leader, it's like this." The middle-aged man who brought Hao Er and the rest over smiled and glanced back at Hao Er and the rest. He then walked to the middle-aged man's side and briefly explained the matter to him. "What? You're saying that after the one-eyed man escaped, he was killed by this kid?" The leader pointed at Hao Er with some astonishment. Hao Er frowned and was a little unhappy that someone was pointing at him like this. However, he did not say anything and took the opportunity to roughly size up the mercenaries. Finally, he glanced at the two men and two women who were sitting by the bonfire and staring at them. Not only was the leader stunned, but the surrounding mercenaries also looked as if they had seen a ghost after hearing their vice leader's words. "Yes, it's like this. When we arrived, the one-eyed man was already dead. He was killed by this kid." Vice Leader Zheng smiled and looked at the cold-faced young man. "So when he asked us to escort them out of the forest, I thought that we were about to go back, so I made the decision to agree. TSK, this kid got lucky. If we hadn't set up so many traps around here, that one-eyed dragon's group wouldn't have been so easily annihilated by us. He, on the other hand, got lucky without doing anything." A mercenary snorted coldly as he glanced at Hao Er with some displeasure and contempt on his face. In their eyes, wasn't this child taking advantage of them? The person that they had besieged to kill had been injured by the combined efforts of the two captains and escaped. Just like a cooked duck, it had flown away just like that. But fortunately, the things on the one-eyed man's body still fell into the hands of their mercenary group. If this brat dared to take them, they would definitely kill him. All right, since that's the case, let's do as old Jing says. In any case, our mission here has already been completed and we are preparing to leave the forest. There's no harm in bringing them along," the leader said as he waved his hand, gesturing for them to stop talking. "The few of you, come over here and rest for a while." Vice Leader Zheng smiled and waved his hand, gesturing for the few children standing at the side to sit by the bonfire. Hao Er paused for a moment, then led Mu Chen and Mu Yu over there. However, just as they were about to sit by the bonfire, a young woman beside them frowned unhappily and said, "Sit over there, don't dirty me." Chapter 45-23. The children had lived in the forest for so many days, so it was naturally impossible for them to keep their clothes clean. Moreover, they were small in stature. Their boots stepped in the mud, and their clothes were scratched by leaves and weeds. They were more or less stained with mud and grass juices and the like. In addition, they had followed the one-eyed man's group for a whole day without stopping to rest, so there were some traces of dust on their little faces. However, they were not dirty and smelly. After all, before this, they would still find a water source to clean themselves. At this time, Hao and Mu Chen's eyes turned cold, and Yu blinked at the woman as if she did not understand what she was saying. 17 glared at the woman with some anger, and her hands secretly clenched into fists. Seeing this, Deputy Zheng was stunned for a moment, but he smiled. "Come over here and sit with me." Then, he said to the young men and women, "Going out naturally can't be compared to staying at home. Moreover, they are only children." "Humph." The woman snorted and looked at the group. "I didn't know that you could take on other people's missions while taking on our mission. These two things have no conflict. Moreover, we have completed half of your mission. As long as we escort you out of this forest, it will be considered complete." The regiment commander smiled and looked at the young men and women, saying, "Moreover, as you can see, they are indeed just a few children. Which family doesn't have a few children? If their own children were to go to such a dangerous place, they would also be worried. Taking them out in passing is not a big deal." Hearing the leader's words and seeing that the surrounding mercenaries were looking at her with some displeasure, the woman bit her lip and said no more with a cold face. Seeing this, the young man at the side tried to smooth things over. He smiled and said, "At that time, we found your Iron Tiger mercenary group because we knew that you were famous for being righteous in the mercenary association. This trip also confirmed the rumors outside. If it were not for you risking your life several times to protect us, I reckon that we would not have completed the mission so quickly this time." He paused and smiled. He looked at Hao and the others and said, "It's these children's fortune to have met you." Young Master Liang's words are too serious." The commander smiled and said politely. This night, Hao and others followed the mercenaries to rest. Until the next morning, when everyone woke up and prepared to set out, Yu also woke up. Rubbing her belly, she said, "Big brother, I want to relieve myself. I'll go with you." Hao stood up, took her hand and was about to leave when a woman's voice sounded. "I'm also going to relieve myself. Why don't you let me bring her along? After all, she's a little girl. Even if you're her brother, it's not convenient for you to follow her." The woman from last night stood up and fixed her hair as she looked at Hao and Mu Yu. "No need," Hao said coldly. "Aya, you little boy, are you still angry about what happened last night?" The woman chuckled as she looked at him and said, "Although what I did last night wasn't right, it's already been a night. Why are you still holding on to it?" Chapter 45-24. That woman bent her waist and asked while looking at Mu Yu with a sweet smile. Mu Yu blinked her pure and innocent big eyes, and after looking at that woman, she sweetly said to Hao, "Big brother, you will go with this big sister, we will come back in a moment." Hearing this, Hao pursed his lips, paused for a moment, then said, "Go. Don't go too far. Yu nodded her head with a smile, then looking at that woman, she revealed a pure and harmless smile, "Big sister, let's go." "Okay." After saying few words to several people beside her, that woman led Yu to the underbrush. Others were preparing to set out after organizing the troops. Not long after, one big and one small figure came back, making the commander, Vice Commander Zheng and others somewhat surprised. That young woman had a face full of disgust for that little girl last night, but today she took that little girl to relieve herself. And when she came back, she had a face full of smiles. Could it be that women were really so fickle? Seeing them return to the troops, the commander instructed, "Okay, let's go. From here to the outside of the forest, if there are no other accidents, it will take at least 3 days, so let's hurry up." A group of people set out again. Those few young men and women were protected in the middle of the troops. And originally Hao and others were also called to the middle by Vice Commander Zheng, but Hao tactfully refused with the reason that his sister-in-law was still young and their speed was not fast. So they gradually fell behind and followed behind the troops. Looking at those few children who fell behind, a touch of coldness flashed through the eyes of that woman in front, and her lips revealed a malicious smile, but that smile disappeared in a flash, so fast that people were unable to perceive it. You went with that woman over there, she didn't do anything, right? Hao lowered his voice and asked. Yu looked ahead with a smile, as if she had found something fun, then said in a low voice, Big brother, that big sister is a bad person. She quietly sprinkled medicinal powder on you, thinking that you, didn't discover it, but you, discovered it. Isn't you, very smart? Her little face was full of smiles, raising a proud smile. Her beautiful eyes curved into crescents because of her smile, looking very cute and likable. However, when Hao, Mu Chen and 17 heard her words, the three people's faces changed. Just as they were about to ask, they saw her use a finger to her pink little mouth, making a shushing gesture. Her beautiful eyes flashed cunningly, like a naughty little fox. She whispered to them, You, took advantage of her peeing, when she was relieving herself. I stole her medicine and sprinkled it on her body when she wasn't paying attention. Hearing this, the three of them were stunned for a moment as if they didn't believe it. However, in a moment of urgency, Hao quickly took a step back and sized her up. Taking advantage of the fact that the people in front of them weren't paying attention to them, he leaned forward and sniffed her body. You, and you, use you, brother. What use will it be? Chapter 45-25. Hao helped Mu Yu take off her clothes and put on a new one. Luckily, that woman had only sprinkled the medicine on her outer clothes. After changing her outer clothes, the smell on her body disappeared. It was still the same pink dress, but the one she changed out of wasn't washed, so it was a little dirty. However, it looked about the same as before. If one didn't look carefully, one wouldn't notice that it was a new one. Hao held her hand and said in a low voice, That's beast powder. The smell isn't obvious, but if beasts smell it, they will go crazy. He had seen this kind of thing once before. It was a very low-grade medicinal powder. Only people with impure thoughts would prepare such things to harm others. That woman was indeed not a good person. Thinking about how Yu had sprinkled medicine on that woman, he pursed his lips. At that time, he would see how she would reap the consequences of her own actions. When it was close to noon, the leader in front waved his hand and turned back. Everyone, take a rest here first. However, just as he finished speaking, he heard the roar of beasts accompanied by the sound of running from not far away. Instantly, he quickly shouted, Alert! Hao and 17 protected the two younger ones as they followed the mercenaries. They only felt the ground trembling slightly because of the running beasts. They looked around and saw 7 to 8 huge ferocious beasts roaring and charging towards them. On the other side, there were more than 10 black dog beasts that were about half the height of a person howling and running towards them. It was as if they were stimulated by the smell in the air. They actually didn't fear the other ferocious beasts in the surroundings. Instead, they pounced forward and scuttled into the mercenaries. Be careful. Damn it! Why are there so many ferocious beasts? The mercenaries were caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the ferocious beasts. Especially since these ferocious beasts were not weak and there were quite a number of them. Other than the 7 to 8 huge ferocious beasts, the 10 or so fast ferocious dog beasts were also very troublesome. After all, they were a mercenary group that had experienced hundreds of battles. After being stunned, they quickly reacted and attacked. On one hand, they protected the few young men and women as they retreated. At the same time, they also protected Hao and the rest as they retreated. However, Hao protected his sister-in-law and tried his best to keep a distance from those young men and women. As they retreated to the side. At this moment, the mercenaries gradually realized that something wasn't right because the ferocious beasts and hounds were roaring and pouncing towards the young men and women. It was as if they had locked onto them and would only attack them. Unfortunately, They were protected by the mercenaries in the middle, and the ferocious beasts and hounds were unable to break through the mercenaries' defensive circle for a while. Of course, there were always accidents. As the chaotic battle escalated, the smell of the ferocious beasts' blood stimulated the beasts, causing them to become more and more frenzied. Suddenly, a black dog rushed forward, opened its mouth and bit the young woman's calf, then pulled her back. Ah! No! Save her! Save her! For a moment, seeing the woman being dragged out, the young men and women all cried out in alarm. They wanted to rush forward to save her, but they were scared off by the fierce beasts that pounced on them. Chapter 45-26. But in the next moment, when they saw the canine beast pouncing on the woman with its front paws while its lower body made a harmonious movement, they were all stunned. What was going on? Ah! Help! Help me! The woman's shrill scream pulled them back from their shock. They saw the canine beast's sharp claws deeply piercing the woman's shoulder and pinning her to the ground with a crazed look as if it had eaten ecstasy. But in the blink of an eye, the canine beast was knocked away by a giant ferocious beast. That giant ferocious beast pressed forward and tore the woman's outer clothes to pieces with its claws, leaving only her blood-stained inner clothes. But because her outer clothes were torn apart and flying to the side, the beasts quickly pounced on it and tore it open, giving the mercenaries a chance to save her. Hao, Mu Chen, 17, and Yu, looked at this scene with some astonishment. But compared to the astonishment of the three, Yu, was more curious and innocent. Hao, retracted his gaze and looked at Yu, asking, Yu, did you really only sprinkle her medicine? That. Yu, lowered her head, and her left and right index fingers lightly poked each other. Finally, she raised her head, and blinking her pair of innocent and pure big eyes, she said in a low voice, Actually, I also sprinkled some other things on her. Hao's mouth twitched when he heard this. Then he knew what she had sprinkled on the woman. One must know that in their space, there were not only elixirs and medicines given by Mother, but also some self-defense medicine. But there were a few that he had instructed not to use carelessly. He did not expect you, to use them on that woman. Could it be that those beasts had gone crazy? Brother, did I do something wrong? Yu, bit her lip and asked softly. Hao, patted her head and said, It is impolite not to reciprocate. Yu, did very well. Yu's eyes lit up when she heard this and her small face lit up with a happy smile. Mu Chen heard this and very much agreed with it. It was impolite not to reciprocate. That woman dared to plot against his sister, how could he not let her down if he did not teach her a lesson? On the other hand, the corners of 17's mouth twitched as she revealed an, as expected, expression. He knew that young Master Hao would definitely say something. Although that woman was a little pitiful, who asked her to scheme against Miss Yu? After all, Miss Yu had two older brothers. Although these two brothers were a little young, one was more powerful than the other. Neither of them was easy to deal with. Quick! Retreat! The leader of the mercenary group shouted. After saving the people, he quickly retreated with his men. Hearing their voices, Hao and the others looked at each other and quickly followed them out of the area. The group of people hurriedly retreated until they reached a safe place. Only then did they breathe a sigh of relief. At this moment, the woman who had been rescued was pale, and the wounds on her body were shocking. Blood was still seeping out from those wounds, and her white inner clothes had long been dyed red. Her lips were trembling slightly, as if she was afraid, and also as if she was shocked. It was as if she had not recovered from her shock, and one of her hands was still clutching her clothes tightly. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.